Section 23 of Celebrated Crimes, Volume 1. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Morgan Scorpion. Celebrated Crimes, Volume 1 by Alexandre, Dumas. Translated by G.B. Ives. Section 23. The Borgias. Chapter 13, Part 1. The time had now come for the Duke of Valentinois to continue the pursuit of his conquests. So, since on the 1st of May in the preceding year, the Pope had pronounced sentence of forfeiture in full consistory against Julius Caesar of Verano, as punishment for the murder of his brother Rudolph for the harbouring of the Pope's enemies, and he had accordingly been mulcted of his fief of Camerino, which was to be handed over to the Apostolic Chamber. Caesar left Rome to put the sentence in execution. Consequently, when he arrived on the frontiers of Perugia, which belonged to his lieutenant, Gianpaolo Baglioni, he sent Oliverotto da Fermo and Orsini of Guarini to lay waste the march of Camerino, at the same time petitioning Guido Giobaldo di Montefeltro, Duke of Urbino, to lend his soldiers and artillery to help him in this enterprise. The unlucky Duke of Urbino, who enjoyed the best possible relations with the Pope, and who had no reason for distrusting Caesar, did not dare refuse. But on the very same day that the Duke of Urbino's troops started for Camerino, Caesar's troops entered the duchy of Urbino, and took possession of Caldi, one of the 4 towns of the little state. The Duke of Urbino knew what awaited him if he tried to resist, and fled incontinently, disguised as a peasant. Thus, in less than 8 days, Caesar was master of his whole duchy, except the fortress of Maiolo and San Leone. The Duke of Valentinois forthwith returned to Camerino, where the inhabitants still held out, encouraged by the presence of Julius Caesar di Verano, their lord, and his 2 sons, Venantio and Hannibal. The eldest son, Gian Maria, had been sent by his father to Venice. The presence of Caesar was the occasion of parleying between the besiegers and besieged. A capitulation was arranged whereby Verano engaged to give up the town, on condition that he and his sons were allowed to retire safe and sound, taking with them their furniture, treasure, and carriages. But this was by no means Caesar's intention, so, profiting by the relaxation in vigilance that had naturally come about in the garrison when the news of the capitulation had been announced, he surprised the town in the night preceding the surrender, and seized Caesar di Verano and his 2 sons, who were strangled a short time after, the father at La Pergola and the sons at Pesaro, by Don Michele Corelio, who, though he had left the position of sbirro for that of a captain, every now and then returned to his first business. Meanwhile, Vitellozzo Vitelli, who had assumed the title of General of the Church, and had under him 800 men-at-arms and 3,000 infantry, was following the secret instructions that he had received from Caesar by word of mouth, and was carrying forward that system of invasion which was to encircle Florence in a network of iron, and in the end make her defence an impossibility. A worthy pupil of his master, in whose school he had learned to use in turn the cunning of a fox and the strength of a lion, he had established an understanding between himself and certain young gentlemen of Arezzo to get that town delivered into his hands. But the plot had been discovered by Guglielmo dei Pazzi, commissary of the Florentine Republic, and he had arrested 2 of the conspirators, whereupon the others, who were much more numerous than was supposed, had instantly dispersed about the town, summoning the citizens to arms. All the Republican faction, who saw in any sort of revolution the means of subjugating Florence, joined their party, set the captives at liberty, and seized Guglielmo. Then, proclaiming the establishment of the ancient constitution, they besieged the citadel, whither Cosimo dei Pazzi, Bishop of Arezzo, the son of Guglielmo, had fled for refuge. He, finding himself invested on every side, sent a messenger in hot haste to Florence to ask for help. Unfortunately for the cardinal, Vitellozzo's troops were nearer to the besiegers than were the soldiers of the most serene republic to the besieged, and instead of help, the whole army of the enemy came down upon him. This army was under the command of Vitellozzo, of Gianpaolo Baglioni, and of Fabio Orsino, and with them were the 2 Medici, ever ready to go wherever there was a league against Florence, and ever ready at the command of Borgia, on any conditions whatsoever, to re-enter the town whence they had been banished. The next day more help in the form of money and artillery arrived, sent by Pandolfo Petrucci, and on the 18th of June the citadel of Arezzo, which had received no news from Florence, was obliged to surrender. Vitellozzo left the men of Arezzo to look after their town themselves, leaving also Fabio Orsina to garrison the citadel with 1,000 men. Then, profiting by the terror that had been spread throughout all this part of Italy by the successive captures of the duchy of Urbino, of Camerino, and of Arezzo, he marched upon Monte San Severino, Castiglione, Aretino, Cortone, and the other towns of the valley of Chiana, which submitted one after the other almost without a struggle. When he was only 10 or 12 leagues from Florence, and dared not, on his own account, attempt anything against her, he made known the state of affairs to the Duke of Valentinois. He, fancying the hour had come at last, for striking the blow so long delayed, started off at once to deliver his answer in person to his faithful lieutenants. But the Florentines, though they had sent no help to Guglielmo de' Pazzi, had demanded aid from Charmont d'Umbest, governor of the Milanese, on behalf of Louis XII., not only explaining the danger they themselves were in, but also Caesar's ambitious projects, namely, that after first overcoming the small principalities and then the states of the second order, he had now, it seemed, reached such a height of pride that he would attack the King of France himself. The news from Naples was disquieting. Serious differences had already occurred between the Count of Armagnac and Gonzalvo di Cordova, and Louis might any day need Florence, whom he had always found loyal and faithful. He therefore resolved to check Caesar's progress, and not only sent him orders to advance no further, step forwards, but also sent off, to give effect to his injunction, the Captain Imbo with 400 lances. The Duke of Valentinois, on the frontier of Tuscany, received a copy of the treaty signed between the Republic and the King of France, a treaty in which the king engaged to help his ally against any enemy whatsoever, and at the same moment the formal prohibition from Louis to advance any further. Caesar also learned that beside the 400 lances with the Captain Imbo, which were on the road to Florence, Louis XII. Had, as soon as he reached Asti, sent off to Parma Louis de la Tromouille and 200 men at arms, 3,000 Swiss, and a considerable train of artillery. In these two movements combined, he saw hostile intentions toward himself, and, turning right about face with his usual agility, he profited by the fact that he had given nothing but verbal instructions to all his lieutenants, and wrote a furious letter to Vitellozzo, reproaching him for compromising his master with a view to his own private interest, and ordering the instant surrender to the Florentines of the towns and fortresses he had taken, threatening to march down with his own troops and take them if he hesitated for a moment. As soon as this letter was written, Caesar departed for Milan, where Louis XII. Had just arrived, bringing with him proof positive that he had been calumniated in the evacuation of the conquered towns. He also was entrusted with the Pope's mission to renew for another 18 months the title of Legate a Latere in France to Cardinal d'Umbest, the friend rather than the minister of Louis XII. Thus, thanks to the public proof of his innocence and private use of his influence, Caesar soon made his peace with the King of France. But this was not all. It was in the nature of Caesar's genius to divert an impending calamity that threatened his destruction so as to come out of it better than before, and he suddenly saw the advantage he might take from the pretended disobedience of his lieutenants. Already he had been disturbed now and again by their growing power, and coveted their towns. Now he thought the hour had perhaps come for suppressing them also, and in the usurpation of their private possessions striking a blow at Florence, who always escaped him at the very moment when he thought to take her. It was indeed an annoying thing to have these fortresses and towns displaying another banner than his own in the midst of the beautiful Romagna which he desired for his own kingdom. For Vitellozzo possessed Città di Castello, Bentivoglio Bologna, Gianpaolo Baglioni was in command of Perugia, Oliverotto had just taken Fermo, and Pandolfo Petrucci was lord of Siena. It was high time that all these returned into his own hands. The lieutenants of the Duke of Valentinois, like Alexander's, were becoming too powerful, and Borgia must inherit from them, unless he were willing to let them become his own heirs. he obtained from Louis XII 300 lances wherewith to march against them. As soon as Vitellozzo Vitelli received Caesar's letter, he perceived that he was being sacrificed to the fear that the King of France inspired. But he was not one of those victims who suffer their throats to be cut in the expiation of a mistake. He was a buffalo of Romagna who opposed his horns to the knife of the butcher. Besides, he had the example of Verano and the Manfredi before him, and, death for death, he preferred to perish in arms. So Vitellozzo convoked at Magione all whose lives or lands were threatened by this new reversal of Caesar's policy. These were Paolo Orsino, Gianpaolo Baglioni, Hermes Bentivoglio, representing his father Gian, Antonio di Venafro, the envoy of Pandolfo Petrucci, Oliver Toxo da Fermo, and the Duke of Urbino. The first 6 had everything to lose, and the last had already lost everything. A treaty of alliance was signed between the confederates. They engaged to resist, whether he attacked them severally or all together. Caesar learned the existence of this league by its first effects. The Duke of Urbino, who was adored by his subjects, had come with a handful of soldiers to the fortress of San Leone, and it had yielded at once. In less than a week, towns and fortresses followed this example, and all the duchy was once more in the hands of the Duke of Urbino. At the same time, each member of the confederacy openly proclaimed his revolt against the common enemy, and took up a hostile attitude. Caesar was at Imola, awaiting the French troops, but with scarcely any men, so that Bentivoglio, who held part of the country, and the Duke of Urbino, who had just reconquered the rest of it, could probably have either taken him or forced him to fly and quit the Romagna, had they marched against him. All the more, since the 2 men on whom he counted, viz. Don Ugo di Cardona, who had entered his service after Capua was taken, and Micheletto, had mistaken his intention, and were all at once separated from him. He had really ordered them to fall back upon Rimini, and bring 200 light horse and 500 infantry, of which they had the command. But, unaware of the urgency of his situation, at the very moment when they were attempting to surprise La Pergola and Fossombrone, they were surrounded by Orsino of Gravina and Vitellozzo. Ugo di Cardona and Micheletto defended themselves like lions, but in spite of their utmost efforts, their little band was cut to pieces, and Ugo di Cardona taken prisoner, while Micheletto only escaped the same fate by lying down among the dead. When night came on, he escaped to Fano. But even alone as he was, almost without troops at Imola, the confederates dared attempt nothing against Caesar, whether because of the personal fear he inspired, or because in him they respected the ally of the King of France. They contented themselves with taking the towns and fortresses in the neighbourhood. Vitellozzo had retaken the fortresses of Fossombrone, Urbino, Cali, and Agobbio. Orsino of Gravina had reconquered Fano and the whole province, while Gian Maria di Verano, the same who by his absence had escaped being massacred with the rest of his family, had re-entered Camerino, borne in triumph by his people. Not even all this could destroy Caesar's confidence in his own good fortune, and while he was on the one hand urging on the arrival of the French troops, and calling in to his prey all those gentlemen known as broken lances, because they went about the country in parties of 5 or 6 only, and attached themselves to anyone who wanted them, he had opened up negotiations with his enemies, certain that from that very day when he should persuade them to a conference they were undone. Indeed, Caesar had the power of persuasion as a gift from heaven, and though they perfectly well knew his duplicity, they had no power of resisting. Not so much of his actual eloquence, as that air of frank good nature which Machiavelli so greatly admired, and which indeed more than once deceived even him, wily politician as he was. In order to get Paolo Orsino to treat with him at Imola, Caesar sent Cardinal Borgia to the confederates as a hostage, and on this Paolo Orsino hesitated no longer, and on the 25th of October, 1502, arrived at Imola. Caesar received him as an old friend, from whom one might have been estranged a few days, because of some slight passing differences. He frankly avowed that all the fault was no doubt on his side, since he had contrived to alienate men who were such loyal lords and also such brave captains. But with men of their nature, he added, an honest, honourable explanation, such as he would give, must put everything once more in statu quo. To prove that it was goodwill, not fear, that brought him back to them, he showed Orsino the letters from Cardinal Ambroise, which announced the speedy arrival of French troops. He showed him those he had collected about him, in the wish, he declared, that they might be thoroughly convinced that what he chiefly regretted in the whole matter was not so much the loss of the distinguished captains who were the very soul of his vast enterprise, as that he had led the world to believe, in a way so fatal to his own interest, that he could for a single instant fail to recognize their merit, adding that he consequently relied upon him, Paolo Orsino, whom he had always cared for most, to bring back the Confederates by a peace which would be as much for the profit of all as a war was hurtful to all, and that he was ready to sign a treaty in consonance with their wishes so long as it should not prejudice his own honour. Orsino was the man Caesar wanted. Full of pride and confidence in himself, he was convinced of the truth of the old proverb that says, "A pope cannot reign 8 days if he has half the Colonnas and the Orsini against him." He believed, therefore, if not in Caesar's good faith, at any rate in the necessity he must feel for making peace. Accordingly he signed with him the following conventions, which only needed ratification, on the 18th of October 1502, which we reproduce here as Machiavelli sent them to the magnificent Republic of Florence. Agreement between the Duke of Valentinois and the Confederates. Let it be known to the parties mentioned below, and to all who shall see these presents, that His Excellency the Duke of Romagna, of the one part, and the Orsini of the other part, together with their confederates, desiring to put an end to differences, enmities, misunderstandings, and suspicions which have arisen between them, have resolved as follows. There shall be between them peace and alliance true and perpetual, with a complete obliteration of wrongs and injuries which may have taken place up to this day, both parties engaging to preserve no resentment of the same, and in conformity with the aforesaid peace and union, His Excellency the Duke of Romagna shall receive into perpetual confederation, league and alliance all the lords aforesaid, and each of them shall promise to defend the estates of all in general, and of each in particular, against any power that may annoy or attack them for any cause whatsoever, excepting always nevertheless the Pope Alexandre VI and His very Christian Majesty Louis XII, King of France. The lords above named promising on the other part to unite in the defence of the person and estates of His Excellency, and also those of the most illustrious lords, Don Gaffredo Borgia, Prince of Squillace, Don Roderigo Borgia, Duke of Sermeta and Bicelli, and Don Gian Borgia, Duke of Camerino and Neggi, all brothers or nephews of the Duke of Romagna. Moreover, since the rebellion and usurpation of Urbino have occurred during the above-mentioned misunderstandings, all the confederates aforesaid, and each of them shall bind themselves to unite all their forces for the recovery of the estates aforesaid, and of such other places as have revolted and been usurped. His Excellency the Duke of Romagna shall undertake to continue to the Orsini and Vitelli their ancient engagements in the way of military service and on the same conditions. His Excellency promises further not to insist on the service in person of more than one of them, as they may choose. The service that the others may render shall be voluntary. He also promises that the second treaty shall be ratified by the Sovereign Pontiff, who shall not compel Cardinal Orsino to reside in Rome longer than shall seem convenient to this prelate. Furthermore, since there are certain differences between the Pope and the Lord Gian Bentivoglio, the confederates aforesaid agree that they shall be put to the arbitration of Cardinal Orsino, of His Excellency the Duke of Romagna, and of the Lord Pandolfo Petrucci, without appeal. Thus the confederates engage, each and all, so soon as they may be required by the Duke of Romagna, to put into his hands as a hostage one of the legitimate sons of each of them, in that place and at that time which he may be pleased to indicate. The same confederates promising, moreover, all and each, that if any project directed against any one of them come to their knowledge, to give warning thereof, and all to prevent such project reciprocally. It is agreed, over and above, between the Duke of Romagna and the confederates aforesaid, to regard as a common enemy any who shall fail to keep the present stipulations, and to unite in the destruction of any states not conforming thereto. Signed, Caesar Paolo Orsino, Agapit, Secretary. End of section number 23. Section 24 of Celebrated Crimes, Volume 1. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Morgan Scorpion. Celebrated Crimes, Volume 1 by Alexandre Dumas. Translated by G.B. Ives. Section 24. The Borgias, Chapter 13, Part 2. At the same time, while Orsino was carrying to the Confederates the treaty drawn up between him and the Duke, Bentivoglio, not willing to submit to the arbitration indicated, made an offer to Caesar of settling their differences by a private treaty, and sent his son to arrange the conditions. After some parleying they were settled as follows. Bentivoglio should separate his fortunes from Vitelli and Orsini. He should furnish the Duke of Valentinois with 100 men-at-arms and 100 mounted archers for 8 years. He should pay 12,000 ducats per annum to Caesar for the support of 100 lances. In return for this, his son Hannibal was to marry the sister of the Archbishop of Enna, who was Caesar's niece, and the Pope was to recognize his sovereignty in Bologna. The King of France, the Duke of Ferrara, and the Republic of Florence were to be the guarantors of this treaty. But the convention brought to the Confederates by Orsino was the cause of great difficulties on their part. Vitellozzo Vitelli in particular, who knew Caesar the best, never ceased to tell the other condottieri that so prompt and easy a peace must needs be the cover to some trap. But since Caesar had meanwhile collected a considerable army at Imala, and the 400 lances lent him by Louis XII had arrived at last, Vitellozzo and Oliverotto decided to sign the treaty that Orsino brought, and to let the Duke of Urbino and the Lord of Camerino know of it. They, seeing plainly that it was henceforth impossible to make a defence unaided, had retired, the one to Città di Castello, and the other into the kingdom of Naples. But Caesar, saying nothing of his intentions, started on the 10th of December, and made his way to Casenna with a powerful army once more under his command. Fear began to spread on all sides, not only in Romagna, but in the whole of northern Italy. Florence, seeing him move away from her, only thought it a blind to conceal his intentions, while Venice, seeing him approach her frontiers, dispatched all her troops to the banks of the Po. Caesar perceived their fear, and lest harm should be done to himself by the mistrust it might inspire, he sent away all French troops in his service as soon as he reached Casenna, except 100 men with Monsieur de Condali, his brother-in-law. It was then seen that he only had 2,000 cavalry and 2,000 infantry with him. Several days were spent in parleying, for at Casenna Caesar found the envoys of the Vitelli and Orsini, who themselves were with their army in the duchy of Urbino. But after the preliminary discussions as to the right course to follow in carrying on the plan of conquest, there arose such difficulties between the general-in-chief and these agents, that they could not but see the impossibility of getting anything settled by intermediaries, and the urgent necessity of a conference between Caesar and one of the chiefs. So Oliverotto ran the risk of joining the Duke in order to make proposals to him, either to march on Tuscany or to take Sinigalia, which was the only place in the Duchy of Urbino that had not yet fallen into Caesar's power. Caesar's reply was that he did not desire to war upon Tuscany, because the Tuscans were his friends, but that he approved of the lieutenant's plans with regard to Sinigalia, and therefore was marching towards Fano. But the daughter of Frederick, the former Duke of Urbino, who held the town of Sinigalia, and who was called the Lady Prefect because she had married Gian della Rovere, whom his uncle Sixtus IV had made prefect of Rome, judging that it would be impossible to defend herself against the forces the Duke of Valentinois was bringing, left the citadel in the hands of a captain, recommending him to get the best terms he could for the town, and took boat for Venice. Caesar learned this news at Rimini, through a messenger from Vitelli and the Orsini, who said that the governor of the citadel, though refusing to yield to them, was quite ready to make terms with him, and consequently they would engage to go to the town and finish the business there. Caesar's reply was that in consequence of this information he was sending some of his troops to Casenna and Imola, for they would be useless to him, as he should now have theirs, which together with the escort he retained would be sufficient, since his only object was the complete pacification of the Duchy of Urbino. He added that this pacification would not be possible if his old friends continued to distrust him, and to discuss through intermediaries alone plans in which their own fortunes were interested as well as his. The messenger returned with this answer, and the confederates, though feeling, it is true, the justice of Caesar's remarks, none the less hesitated to comply with his demand. Vitellozzo Vitelli in particular showed a want of confidence in him which nothing seemed able to subdue, but, pressed by Oliverotto, Gravina, and Orsino, he consented at last to await the Duke's coming, making concession rather because he could not bear to appear more timid than his companions, than because of any confidence he felt in the return of friendship that Borgia was displaying. The Duke learned the news of this decision, so much desired, when he arrived at Fano on the 20th of December, 1502. At once he summoned 8 of his most faithful friends, amongst whom were Denna, his nephew Michelotto, and Ugo di Cardona, and ordered them, as soon as they arrived at Sinigalia, and had seen Vitellozzo, Gravina, Oliverata, and Gorsino come out to meet them, on a pretext of doing them honour, to place themselves on the right and left hand of the 4 generals, 2 beside each, so that at a given signal they might either stab or arrest them. Next he assigned to each of them his particular man, bidding them not quit his side until he had re-entered Sinigalia and arrived at the quarters prepared for him. Then he sent orders to such of the soldiers as were in cantonments in the neighbourhood to assemble to the number of 8,000 on the banks of the Meterus, a little river of Umbria, which runs into the Adriatic and has been made famous by the defeat of Hannibal. The Duke arrived at the rendezvous given to his army on the 31st of December, and instantly sent out in front 200 horse, and immediately behind them his infantry, following close in the midst of his men-at-arms, following the coast of the Adriatic, with the mountains on his right, and the sea on his left, which in part of the way left only space for the army to march 10 abreast. After 4 hours' march, the Duke at a turn of the path perceived Sinigalia, nearly a mile distant from the sea, and a bowshot from the mountains. Between the army and the town ran a little river, whose banks he had to follow for some distance. At last he found a bridge opposite a suburb of the town, and here Caesar ordered his cavalry to stop. It was drawn up in 2 lines, one between the road and the river, the other on the side of the country, leaving the whole width of the road to the infantry, which latter defiled, crossed the bridge, and entering the town, drew themselves up in battle array in the great square. On their side, Vitellozzo, Gravina, Orsino, and Oliverotto, to make room for the Duke's army, had quartered their soldiers in little towns or villages in the neighbourhood of Sinigalia. Oliverotto alone had kept nearly 1,000 infantry and 150 horse, who were in barracks in the suburb through which the Duke entered. Caesar had made only a few steps towards the town when he perceived Vitellozzo at the gate, with the Duke of Gravina and Orsino, who all came out to meet him, the last 2 quite gay and confident, but the first so gloomy and dejected that you would have thought he foresaw the fate that was in store for him, and doubtless he had not been without same presentiments, for when he left his army to come to Sinigalia, he had bidden them farewell as though never to meet again, had commended the care of his family to the captains, and embraced his children with tears, a weakness which appeared strange to all who knew him as a brave condottiere. The Duke marched up to them, holding out his hand, as a sign that all was over and forgotten, and did it with an air at once so loyal and so smiling that Gravina and Orsino could no longer doubt the genuine return of his friendship. And it was only Vitellozzo still appeared sad. At the same moment, exactly as they had been commanded, the Duke's accomplices took their posts on the right and left of those they were to watch, who were all there except Oliverotto, whom the Duke could not see, and began to seek with uneasy looks. But as he crossed the suburb he perceived him exercising his troops on the square. Caesar at once dispatched Michelotto and Denna, with a message that it was a rash thing to have his troops out, when they might easily start some quarrel with the Duke's men, and bring about an affray. It would be much better to settle them in barracks, and then come to join his companions, who were with Caesar. Oliverotto, drawn by the same fate as his friends, made no objection, ordered his soldiers indoors, and put his horse to the gallop to join the Duke, escorted on either side by Enna and Michelotto. Caesar, on seeing him, called him, took him by the hand, and continued his march to the palace that had been prepared for him, his 4 victims following after. Arrived on the threshold, Caesar dismounted, and, signing to the leader of the men-at-arms to await his orders, he went in first, followed by Oliverotto, Gravina, Vitellozzo Vitelli, and Orsino, each accompanied by his 2 satellites. But scarcely had they gone upstairs and into the first room when the door was shut behind them, and Caesar turned round, saying, "The hour has come." This was the signal agreed upon. Instantly the former confederates were seized, thrown down, and forced to surrender with a dagger at their throat. Then, while they were being carried to a dungeon, Caesar opened the window, went out on the balcony, and cried out to the leader of his men-at-arms, "Go forward!" The man was in the secret. He rushed on with his band towards the barracks where Oliverotto's soldiers had just been consigned, and they, suddenly surprised and off their guard, were at once made prisoners. Then the Duke's troops began to pillage the town, and he summoned Machiavelli. Caesar and the Florentine envoy were nearly 2 hours shut up together, and since Machiavelli himself recounts the history of this interview, we will give his own words. "He summoned me," says the Florentine ambassador, "and in the calmest manner showed me his joy at the success of this enterprise, which he assured me he had spoken of to me the evening before. I remember that he did, but I did not at that time understand what he meant. Next he explained, in terms of much feeling and lively affection for our city, the different motives which had made him desire your alliance, a desire to which he hopes you will respond. He ended with charging me to lay 3 proposals before your lordships. First, that you rejoice with him in the destruction at a single blow of the mortal enemies of the king, himself, and you, and the consequent disappearance of all seeds of trouble and dissension likely to waste Italy. This service of his, together with his refusal to allow the prisoners to march against you, ought, he thinks, to excite your gratitude towards him. Secondly, he begs that you will at this juncture give him a striking proof of your friendliness, by urging your cavalry's advance towards Borgo, and there assembling some infantry also, in order that they may march with him, should need arise, on Castello or on Perugia. Lastly, he desires, and this is his 3rd condition, that you arrest the Duke of Urbino if he should flee from Castello into your territories, when he learns that Vitellozzo is a prisoner. When I objected that to give him up would not beseem the dignity of the Republic, and that you would never consent, he approved of my words, and said that it would be enough for you to keep the Duke, and not give him his liberty without his Excellency's permission. I have promised to give you all this information, to which he awaits your reply." The same night 8 masked men descended to the dungeon where the prisoners lay. They believed at that moment that the fatal hour had arrived for all. But this time the executioners had to do with Vitellozzo and Oliverotto alone. When these 2 captains heard that they were condemned, Oliverotto burst forth into reproaches against Vitellozzo, saying that it was all his fault that they had taken up arms against the Duke. Not a word Vitellozzo answered except a prayer that the Pope might grant him plenary indulgence for all his sins. Then the masked men took them away, leaving Orsino and Gravina to await a similar fate, and led away the 2 chosen out to die to a secluded spot outside the ramparts of the town, where they were strangled and buried at once in 2 trenches that had been dug beforehand. The 2 others were kept alive until it should be known if the Pope had arrested Cardinal Orsino, Archbishop of Florence and Lord of Santa Croce, and when the answer was received in the affirmative from His Holiness, Gravina and Orsino, who had been transferred to a castle, were likewise strangled. The Duke, leaving instructions with Michelotto, set off for Sinigalia as soon as the first execution was over, assuring Machiavelli that he had never had any other thought than that of giving tranquillity to the Romagna and to Tuscany, and also that he thought he had succeeded by taking and putting to death the men who had been the cause of all the trouble, also that any other revolt that might take place in the future would be nothing but sparks that a drop of water could extinguish. The Pope had barely learned that Caesar had his enemies in his power when, eager to play the same winning game himself, he announced to Cardinal Orsino, though it was then midnight, that his son had taken Sinigalia, and gave him an invitation to come the next morning and talk over the good news. The cardinal, delighted at this increase of favour, did not miss his appointment. So in the morning he started on horseback for the Vatican. But at a turn of the first street he met the governor of Rome with a detachment of cavalry, who congratulated him on the happy chance that they were taking the same road, and accompanied him to the threshold of the Vatican. There the cardinal dismounted and began to ascend the stairs. Scarcely, however, had he reached the first landing before his mules and carriages were seized and shut in the palace stables. When he entered the hall of the Perropont, he found that he and all his suite were surrounded by armed men, who led him into another apartment, called the Vicar's Hall, where he found the Abbot Alviano, the Protonotary Orsino, Jacopo Santa Croce, and Rinaldo Orsino, who were all prisoners like himself. At the same time the governor received orders to seize the castle of Monte Giardino, which belonged to the Orsini, and take away all the jewels, all the hangings, all the furniture, and all the silver that he might find. The governor carried out his orders conscientiously, and brought to the Vatican everything he seized, down to the cardinal's account book. On consulting the book, the Pope found out two things. First, that a sum of 2,000 ducats was due to the cardinal, no debtor's name being mentioned. Secondly, that the cardinal had bought 3 months before, for 1,500 Roman crowns, a magnificent pearl which could not be found among the objects belonging to him, on which Alexandre ordered that from that very moment until the negligence in the cardinal's account was repaired, the men who were in the habit of bringing him food twice a day on behalf of his mother should not be admitted into the Castle St. Angelo. The same day the cardinal's mother sent the Pope the 2,000 ducats, and the next day his mistress, in man's attire, came in person to bring the missing pearl. His Holiness, however, was so struck with her beauty in this costume that, we are told, he let her keep the pearl for the same price she had paid for it. Then the Pope allowed the cardinal to have his food brought as before, and he died of poison on the 22nd of February, that is, 2 days after his accounts had been set right. The same night the Prince of Squillaci set off to take possession, in the Pope's name, of the lands of the deceased. End of section 24.
Section 25 of Celebrated Crimes, Volume 1. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Anne Boulay. Celebrated Crimes, Volume 1, by Alexandre Dumas. Translated by G.B. Ives. Section 25. The Borgias, Chapter 14. The Duke of Valentinois had continued his road towards Città di Castello and Perugia, and had seized these two towns without striking a blow, for the Vitelli had fled from the former, and the latter had been abandoned by Gianpaolo Bagliano, with no attempt whatever at resistance. There still remained Siena, where Pandolfo Petrucci was shut up, the only man remaining of all who had joined the league against Caesar. But Siena was under the protection of the French. Besides, Siena was not one of the states of the Church, and Caesar had no rights there. Therefore he was content with insisting upon Pandolfo Petrucci's leaving the town and retiring to Lucca, which he accordingly did. Then, all on this side being peaceful and the whole of Romagna in subjection, Caesar resolved to return to Rome and help the Pope to destroy all that was left of the Orsini. This was all the easier because Louis XII, having suffered reverses in the kingdom of Naples, had since then been much more concerned with his own affairs to disturb himself about his allies. So Caesar, doing for the neighborhood of the Holy See the same thing he had done for the Romagna, seized in succession Vicovaro, Serra, Palambura, Lanzano, and Cerveti. When these conquests were achieved, having nothing else to do now that he had brought the pontifical states into subjection from the frontiers of Naples to those of Venice, he returned to Rome to concert with his father as to the means of converting his duchy into a kingdom. Caesar arrived at the right moment to share with Alexander the property of Cardinal Gian Michele, who had just died, having received a poisoned cup from the hands of the Pope. The future king of Italy found his father preoccupied with a grand project. He had resolved, for the feast of St. Peter's, to create 9 cardinals. What he had to gain from these nominations is as follows. First, the cardinals elected would leave all their offices vacant, These offices would fall into the hands of the Pope, and he would sell them. Secondly, each of them would buy his election, more or less dear according to his fortune. The price, left to be settled at the Pope's fancy, would vary from 10,000 to 40,000 ducats. Lastly, since as cardinals, they would by law lose the right of making a will, the Pope, in order to inherit from them, had only to poison them. This put him in the position of a butcher who, if he needs money, has only to cut the throat of the fattest sheep in the flock. The nomination came to pass. The new cardinals were Giovanni Castellaro Valentine, Archbishop of Trani, Francesco Remolini, ambassador from the King of Aragon, Francesco Solderini, Bishop of Volterra, Melchiori Copus, Bishop of Brisina, Nicholas Friesque, Bishop of Frejas, Francesco di Sprate, Bishop of Liome, Adriano Castellense, Clerk of the Chamber, Treasurer General, and Secretary of the Briefs, Francesco Boris, Bishop of Elva, Patriarch of Constantinople, and Secretary to the Pope, and Giacomo Casanova, Protonotary and private chaplain to His Holiness. The price of their simony paid and their vacated offices sold, the Pope made his choice of those he was to poison. The number was fixed at 3, 1 old and 2 new. The old one was Cardinal Casanova, and the new ones Melchior Copus and Adriano Castellense, who had taken the name of Adrian of Carneta, from that town where he had been born, and where, in the capacity of Clerk of the Chamber, Treasurer General, and Secretary of Briefs, he had amassed an immense fortune. So when all was settled between Caesar and the Pope, they invited their chosen guests to supper in a vineyard situated near the Vatican, belonging to the Cardinal of Corneto. In the morning of this day, the 2nd of August, they sent their servants and the steward to make all preparations, and Caesar himself gave the Pope's butlers 2 bottles of wine prepared with the white powder resembling sugar, whose mortal properties he had so often proved, and gave orders that he was to serve this wine only when he was told, and only to persons specially indicated. The butler accordingly put the wine in a sideboard apart, bidding the waiters on no account to touch it, as it was reserved for the Pope's drinking. The poison of the Borgias, say contemporary writers, was of 2 kinds, powder and liquid. The poison in the form of powder was a sort of white flour, almost impalpable, with the taste of sugar, and called cantarella. Its composition is unknown. The liquid poison was prepared, we are told, in so strange a fashion that we cannot pass it by in silence. We repeat here what we read, and vouch for nothing ourselves, lest science should give us the lie. A strong dose of arsenic was administered to a boar. As soon as the poison began to take effect, he was hung up by his heels, convulsions supervened, and a froth deadly and abundant ran out from his jaws. It was this froth, collected in a silver vessel and transferred into a bottle hermetically sealed, that made the liquid poison. Towards evening, Alexander VI walked from the Vatican leaning on Caesar's arm, and turned his steps toward the vineyard, accompanied by Cardinal Carafa. But as the heat was great and the climb rather steep, the Pope, when he reached the top, stopped to take breath. Then putting his hand on his breast, he found that he had left in his bedroom a chain he always wore round his neck, which suspended a gold medallion that enclosed the sacred host. He owed this habit to a prophecy that an astrologer had made, that so long as he carried about a sacred wafer, neither steel nor poison could take hold upon him. Now, finding himself without his talisman, he ordered Monsignor Carafa to hurry back at once to the Vatican, and told him in which part of his room he had left it, so that he might get it and bring it him without delay. Then, as the walk had made him thirsty, he turned to a valet, giving signs with his hand as he did so that his messenger should make haste, and asked for something to drink. Caesar, who was also thirsty, ordered the man to bring 2 glasses. By a curious coincidence, the butler had just gone back to the Vatican to fetch some magnificent peaches that had been sent that very day to the Pope, but which had been forgotten when he came here. So the valet went to the under-butler, saying that His Holiness and Monsignor the Duke of Romagna were thirsty and asking for a drink. The under-butler, seeing 2 bottles of wine set apart, and having heard that this wine was reserved for the Pope, took one, and telling the valet to bring 2 glasses on a tray, poured out this wine, which both drank, little thinking that it was what they had themselves prepared to poison their guests. Meanwhile, Carafa hurried to the Vatican, and, as he knew the palace well, went up to the Pope's bedroom, a light in his hand, and attended by no servant. As he turned round a corridor, a puff of wind blew out his lamp. Still, as he knew the way, he went on, thinking there was no need of seeing to find the object he was in search of. But as he entered the room he recoiled a step, with a cry of terror. He beheld a ghastly apparition. It seemed that there before his eyes, in the middle of the room, between the door and the cabinet which held the medallion, Alexander VI, motionless and livid, was lying on a bier at whose 4 corners there burned 4 torches. The cardinal stood still for a moment, his eyes fixed, and his hair standing on end, without strength to move either backward or forward. Then, thinking it was all a trick of fancy or an apparition of the devil's making, he made the sign of the cross, invoking God's holy name. All instantly vanished, torches, bier, and corpse, and the seeming mortuary chamber was once more in darkness. Then Cardinal Carafa, who has himself recorded this strange event, and who was afterwards Pope Paul IV, entered baldly, and though an icy sweat ran down his brow, he went straight to the cabinet, and in the drawer indicated found the gold chain and the medallion, took them, and hastily went out to give them to the Pope. He found supper served, the guests arrived, and His Holiness ready to take his place at table. As soon as the cardinal was in sight, His Holiness, who was very pale, made one step towards him. Carafa doubled his pace and handed the medallion to him. But as the Pope stretched forth his arm to take it, he fell back with a cry, instantly followed by violent convulsions. An instant later, as he advanced to render his father assistance, Caesar was similarly seized. The effect of the poison had been more rapid than usual, for Caesar had doubled the dose, and there is little doubt that their heated condition increased its activity. The 2 stricken men were carried side by side to the Vatican, where each was taken to his own rooms. From that moment they never met again. As soon as he reached his bed, the Pope was seized with a violent fever, which did not give way to emetics or to bleeding. Almost immediately it became necessary to administer the last sacraments of the Church, but his admirable bodily constitution, which seemed to have defied old age, was strong enough to fight 8 days with death. At last, after a week of mortal agony, he died, without once uttering the name of Caesar or Lucretia, who were the 2 poles around which had turned all his affections and all his crimes. His age was 72, and he had reigned 11 years. Caesar, perhaps because he had taken less of the fatal beverage, perhaps because the strength of his youth overcame the strength of the poison, or maybe, as some say, because when he reached his own rooms he had swallowed an antidote known only to himself, was not so prostrated as to lose sight for a moment of the terrible position he was in. He summoned his faithful Michelotto, with those he could best count on among his men, and disposed this band in the various rooms that led to his own, ordering the chief never to leave the foot of his bed, but to sleep lying on a rug, his hand upon the handle of his sword. The treatment had been the same for Caesar as for the Pope, but in addition to bleeding and emetics, strange baths were added, which Caesar had himself asked for, having heard that in a similar case they had once cured Ladislaus, king of Naples. 4 posts, strongly welded to the floor and ceiling, were set up in his room, like the machines at which farriers shoe horses. Every day a bull was brought in, turned over on his back and tied by his 4 legs to the 4 posts. Then, when he was thus fixed, a cut was made in his belly 1.5 feet long, through which the intestines were drawn out. Then Caesar slipped into this living bath of blood, when the bull was dead. Caesar was taken out and rolled up in burning hot blankets, where, after copious perspirations, he almost always felt some sort of relief. Every 2 hours Caesar sent to ask news of his father. He hardly waited to hear that he was dead before, though still at death's door himself, he summoned up all the force of character and presence of mind that naturally belonged to him. He ordered Michelotto to shut the doors of the Vatican before the report of Alexander's decease could spread about the town, and forbade anyone whatsoever to enter the Pope's apartments until the money and papers had been removed. Michelato obeyed at once, went to find Cardinal Casanova, held a dagger at his throat, and made him deliver up the keys of the Pope's rooms and cabinets. Then, under his guidance, took away 2 chests full of gold, which perhaps contained 100,000 Roman crowns in specie, several boxes full of jewels, much silver, and many precious vases. All these were carried to Caesar's chamber. The guards of the room were doubled. Then the doors of the Vatican were once more thrown open, and the death of the Pope was proclaimed. Although the news was expected, it produced none the less a terrible effect in Rome, for although Caesar was still alive, his condition left everyone in suspense. Had the mighty Duke of Romagna, the powerful condottiere who had taken 30 towns and 15 fortresses in 5 years, been seated, sword in hand, upon his charger, nothing would have been uncertain of fluctuating even for a moment. For, as Caesar afterwards told Machiavelli, his ambitious soul had provided for all things that could occur on the day of the Pope's death, except the one that he should be dying himself. But being nailed down to his bed, sweating off the effects the poison had wrought, so though he had kept his power of thinking, he could no longer act, but must needs wait and suffer the course of events, instead of marching on in front and controlling them. Thus he was forced to regulate his actions no longer by his own plans, but according to circumstances. His most bitter enemies, who could press him hardest, were the Orsini and the Colonnas. From the one family he had taken their blood, from the other their goods. So he addressed himself to those to whom he could return what he had taken, and opened negotiations with the Colonnas. Meanwhile, the obsequies of the Pope were going forward. The Vice-Chancellor had sent out orders to the highest among the clergy, the superiors of convents, and the secular orders, not to fail to appear, according to regular custom, on pain of being despoiled of their office and dignities, each bringing his own company to the Vatican, to be present at the Pope's funeral. Each therefore appeared on the day and at the hour appointed at the pontifical palace, whence the body was to be conveyed to the church of St. Peter's, and there buried. The corpse was found to be abandoned and alone in the mortuary chamber, for everyone of the name of Borgia, except Caesar, lay hidden, not knowing what might come to pass. This was indeed well justified, for Fabio Orsino, meeting one member of the family, stabbed him, and as a sign of the hatred they had sworn to one another, bathed his mouth and hands in the blood. The agitation in Rome was so great that when the corpse of Alexander VI was about to enter the church, there occurred a kind of panic, such as will suddenly arise in times of popular agitation, instantly causing so great a disturbance in the funeral cortege that the guards drew up in battle array, the clergy fled into the sacristy, and the bearers dropped the bier. The people, tearing off the pall which covered it, disclosed the corpse, and everyone could see with impunity and close at hand the man who, 15 days before, had made princes, kings, and emperors tremble, from one end of the world to the other. But in accordance with that religious feeling towards death which all men instinctively feel, and which alone survives every other, even in the heart of the atheist, the bier was taken up again and carried to the foot of the great altar in St. Peter's, where, set on trestles, it was exposed to public view. But the body had become so black, so deformed and swollen, that it was horrible to behold. From its nose a bloody matter escaped, the mouth gaped hideously, and the tongue was so monstrously enlarged that it filled the whole cavity. To this frightful appearance was added a decomposition so great that, although at the Pope's funeral it is customary to kiss the hand which bore the fisherman's ring, not one approached to offer this mark of respect and religious reverence to the representative of God on earth. Towards 7 o'clock in the evening, when the declining day adds so deep a melancholy to the silence of a church, 4 porters and 2 working carpenters carried the corpse into the chapel where it was to be interred, and, lifting it off the catafalque, where it lay in state, put it in the coffin which was to be its last abode. But it was found that the coffin was too short, and the body could not be got in till the legs were bent and thrust in with violent blows. Then the carpenters put on the lid, and while one of them sat on top to force the knees to bend, the others hammered in the nails. amid those Shakespearean pleasantries that sound as a last orison in the ear of the mighty. Then, says Tommaso Tommasi, he was placed on the right of the great altar of St. Peter's, beneath a very ugly tomb. The next morning this epitaph was found inscribed upon the tomb: Vendit Alexander Claves, altaria Christum, emerat ille prius, vendere iuc potest. That is, Pope Alexander sold the Christ, the altars and the keys, but anyone who buys a thing may sell it if he please. End of section 25. Section 26 of Celebrated Crimes, Volume 1. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Anne Boulay. Celebrated Crimes, Volume 1, by Alexandre Dumas, translated by G.B. Ives. Section 26. The Borgias, Chapter 15. From the effect produced at Rome by Alexander's death, one may imagine what happened not only in the whole of Italy, but also in the rest of the world. For a moment, Europe swayed, for the column which supported the vault of the political edifice had given way, and the star with eyes of flame and rays of blood, round which all things had revolved for the last 11 years, was now extinguished, and for a moment the world, on a sudden struck motionless, remained in silence and darkness. After the first moment of stupefaction, all who had an injury to avenge arose and hurried to the chase. Sforza retook Pesaro, Baglioni Perugia, Guido and Ubaldo Urbino, and La Rovere Sinigaglia. The Vitelli entered Città di Castello, the Appiani Piombino, the Orsini Monte Giordano, and their other territories. The Romagna alone remained impassive and loyal, for the people, who have no concern with the quarrels of the great, provided they do not affect themselves, had never been so happy as under the government of Caesar. The Colonnas were pledged to maintain a neutrality, and had been consequently restored to the possession of their castles, and the cities of Chuesano, Capodano, Frascati, Rocca di Papa, and Nettuno, which they found in a better condition than when they had left them, as the Pope had had them embellished and fortified. Caesar was still in the Vatican with his troops, who, loyal to him in his misfortune, kept watch about the palace, where he was writhing on his bed of pain and roaring like a wounded lion. The cardinals, who had in their first terror fled, each his own way, instead of attending the Pope's obsequies, began to assemble once more, some at the Minerva, others around Cardinal Carafa. Frightened by the troops that Caesar still had, especially since the command was entrusted to Michelato, they collected all the money they could to levy an army of 2,000 soldiers with. Charles Teneo at their head, with the title of captain of the Sacred College. It was then hoped that peace was reestablished, when it was heard that Prospero Colonna was coming with 3,000 men from the side of Naples, and Fabio Orsino from the side of Viterbo with 200 horse and more than 1,000 infantry. Indeed, they entered Rome at only 1 day's interval one from another. By so similar an ardor were they inspired. Thus there were 5 armies in Rome. Caesar's army, holding the Vatican and the Borgo. The army of the Bishop of Nicastro, who had received from Alexander the guardianship of Castle Sant'Angelo, and had shut himself up there, refusing to yield. The army of the Sacred College, which was stationed round about the Minerva. The army of Prospero Colonna, which was encamped at the Capitol. And the army of Fabio Orsino, in barracks at the Ripetta. On their side, the Spaniards had advanced to Terracino, and the French to Nepi. The cardinals saw that Rome now stood upon a mine which the least spark might cause to explode. They summoned the ambassadors of the Emperor of Germany, the kings of France and Spain, and the Republic of Venice to raise their voice in the name of their masters. The ambassadors, impressed with the urgency of the situation, began by declaring the Sacred College inviolable. They then ordered the Orsini, the Colonnas, and the Duke of Valentinois to leave Rome and go each his own way. The Orsini were the first to submit. The next morning their example was followed by the Colonnas. No one was left but Caesar, who said he was willing to go, but desired to make his conditions beforehand. The Vatican was undermined, he declared, and if his demands were refused, he and those who came to take him should be blown up together. It was known that his were never empty threats they came to terms with. Caesar promised to remain 10 miles away from Rome the whole time the conclave lasted, and not to take any action against the town or any other of the ecclesiastical states. Fabio Orsino and Prospero Colonna had made the same promises. It was agreed that Caesar should quit Rome with his army, artillery, and baggage, and to ensure his not being attacked or molested in the streets, the Sacred College should add to his numbers 400 infantry, who, in case of attack or insult, would fight for him. The Venetian ambassador answered for the Orsini, the Spanish ambassador for the Colonnas, the ambassador of France for Caesar. At the day and hour appointed, Caesar sent out his artillery, which consisted of 18 pieces of cannon and 400 infantry of the Sacred College, on each of whom he bestowed a ducat. Behind the artillery came 100 chariots escorted by his advance guard. The Duke was carried out of the gate of the Vatican. He lay on a bed covered with a scarlet canopy, supported by 12 halberdiers, leaning forward on his cushions so that no one might see his face, with its purple lips and bloodshot eyes. Beside him was his naked sword, to show that, feeble as he was, he could use it at need. His finest charger, caparisoned in black velvet embroidered with his arms, walked beside the bed, led by a page, so that Caesar could mount in case of surprise or attack. Before him and behind, both right and left, marched his army, their arms at rest, but without beating of drums or blowing of trumpets. This gave a somber funereal air to the whole procession, which at the gate of the city met Prospero Colonna awaiting it with a considerable band of men. Caesar thought at first that, breaking his word as he had so often done himself, Prospero Colonna was going to attack him. He ordered a halt and prepared to mount his horse. But Prospero Colonna, seeing the state he was in, advanced to his bedside alone. He came, against expectation, to offer him an escort, fearing an ambuscade on the part of Fabio Orsino, who had loudly sworn that he would lose his honor or avenge the death of Paolo Orsina, his father. Caesar thanked Colonna, and replied that from the moment that Orsini stood alone, he ceased to fear him. Then Colonna saluted the Duke, and rejoined his men, directing them towards Albano, while Caesar took the road to Città Castellana, which had remained loyal. When there, Caesar found himself not only master of his own fate, but of others as well. Of the 22 votes he owned in the Sacred College, 12 had remained faithful, and as the conclave was composed in all of 37 cardinals, he with his 12 votes could make the majority incline to whichever side he chose. Accordingly, he was courted both by the Spanish and the French party, each desiring the election of a pope of their own nation. Caesar listened, promising nothing and refusing nothing. He gave his 12 votes to Francesco Piccolomini, Cardinal of Siena, one of his father's creatures who had remained his friend, and the latter was elected on the 8th of October and took the name of Pius III. Caesar's hopes did not deceive him. Pius III was hardly elected before he sent him a safe conduct to Rome. The Duke came back with 250 men at arms, 250 light horse, and 800 infantry, and lodged in his palace, the soldiers camping round about. Meanwhile the Orsini, pursuing their projects of vengeance against Caesar, had been levying many troops at Perugia and the neighborhood to bring against him to Rome, as they fancied that France, in whose service they were engaged, was humoring the Duke for the sake of the 12 votes, which were wanted to secure the election of Cardinal Amboise at the next conclave. They went over to the service of Spain. Meanwhile, Caesar was signing a new treaty with Louis XII, by which he engaged to support him with all his forces, and even with his person, so soon as he could ride, in maintaining his conquest of Naples. Louis, on his side, guaranteed that he should retain the possession of the states he still held, and promised his help in recovering those he had lost. The day when this treaty was made known, Gonzalvo di Cordova proclaimed to the sound of a trumpet in all the streets of Rome that every Spanish subject serving in a foreign army was at once to break his engagement on pain of being found guilty of high treason. This measure robbed Caesar of 10 or 12 of his best officers and of nearly 300 men. Then the Orsini, seeing his army thus reduced, entered Rome, supported by the Spanish ambassador, and summoned Caesar to appear before the Pope and the Sacred College and give an account of his crimes. Faithful to his engagements, Pius III replied that in his quality of sovereign prince, the Duke in his temporal administration was quite independent and was answerable for his actions to God alone. But as the Pope felt he could not much longer support Caesar against his enemies for all his goodwill, he advised him to try to join the French army, which was still advancing on Naples, in the midst of which he would alone find safety. Caesar resolved to retire to Bracciano, where Gian Giordano Orsino, who had once gone with him to France, and who was the only member of the family who had not declared against him, offered him an asylum in the name of Cardinal Dumas. So one morning he offered his troops to march for this town, and, taking his place in their midst, he left Rome. But though Caesar had kept his intentions quiet, the Orsini had been forewarned, and, taking out all the troops they had by the gate of San Patricio, they had made a long detour and blocked Caesar's way. So when the latter arrived at Storta, he found the Orsini's army drawn up awaiting him in numbers exceeding his own by at least one half. Caesar saw that to come to blows in his then feeble state was to rush on certain destruction. So he ordered his troops to retire, and, being a first-rate strategist, echeloned his retreat so skillfully that his enemies, though they followed, dared not attack him, and he re-entered the pontifical town without the loss of a single man. This time Caesar went straight to the Vatican, to put himself more directly under the Pope's protection. He distributed his soldiers about the palace, so as to guard all its exits. Now the Orsini, resolved to make an end of Caesar, had determined to attack him wheresoever he might be, with no regard to the sanctity of the place. This they attempted, but without success, as Caesar's men kept a good guard on every side, and offered a strong defense. Then the Orsini, not being able to force the guard of the castle Sant'Angelo, hoped to succeed better with the Duke by leaving Rome and then returning by the Torriani gate. But Caesar anticipated this move, and they found the gate guarded and barricaded. Nonetheless, they pursued their design, seeking by open violence the vengeance they had hoped to obtain by craft, and, having surprised the approaches to the gate, set fire to it. A passage gained, they made their way into the gardens of the castle, where they found Caesar awaiting them at the head of his cavalry. Face to face with danger, the Duke had found his old strength, and he was the first to rush upon his enemies, loudly challenging Orsino in the hope of killing him should they meet. But either Orsino did not hear him or dared not fight, and after an exciting contest, Caesar, who was numerically 2/3 weaker than his enemy, saw his cavalry cut to pieces, and after performing miracles of personal strength and courage, was obliged to return to the Vatican. There he found the Pope in mortal agony. The Orsini, tired of contending against the old man's word of honor pledged to the Duke, had by the interposition of Pandolfo Petrucci gained the ear of the Pope's surgeon, who placed a poisoned plaster upon a wound in his leg. The Pope then was actually dying when Caesar, covered with dust and blood, entered his room, pursued by his enemies, who knew no check till they reached the palace walls, behind which the remnant of his army still held their ground. Pius III, who knew he was about to die, sat up in his bed, gave Caesar the key of the corridor which led to the castle Sant'Angelo, and an order addressed to the governor to admit him and his family, to defend him to the last extremity, and to let him go wherever he thought fit, and then fell fainting on his bed. Caesar took his 2 daughters by the hand, and, followed by the little dukes of Sermonetta and Nepi, took refuge in the last asylum open to him. The same night the Pope died. He had reigned only 26 days. After his death, Caesar, who had cast himself fully dressed upon his bed, heard his door open at 2 o'clock in the morning. Not knowing what anyone might want of him at such an hour, he raised himself on one elbow and felt for the handle of his sword with his other hand. But at first glance he recognized his nocturnal visitor, Giuliano della Rovere. Utterly exhausted by the poison, abandoned by his troops, fallen as he was from the height of his power, Caesar, who could now do nothing for himself, could yet make a pope. Giuliano della Rovere had come to buy the votes of his 12 cardinals. Caesar imposed his conditions, which were accepted. If elected, Giuliano della Rovere was to help Caesar to recover his territories in Romagna. Caesar was to remain general of the church, and Francesco Maria della Rovere, prefect of Rome, was to marry one of Caesar's daughters. On these conditions, Caesar sold his 12 cardinals to Giuliano. The next day, at Giuliano's request, the Sacred College ordered the Orsini to leave Rome for the whole time occupied by the conclave. On the 31st of October, 1503, at the first scrutiny, Giuliano della Rovere was elected pope and took the name of Julius II. He was scarcely installed in the Vatican when he made it his first care to summon Caesar and give him his former rooms there. Then, since the Duke was fully restored to health, he began to busy himself with the re-establishment of his affairs, which had suffered sadly of late. The defeat of his army and his own escape to Sant'Angelo, where he was supposed to be a prisoner, had brought about great changes in Romagna. Cesena was once more in the power of the church, as formerly it had been. Gian Sforza had again entered Pizarro. Ordelaffi had seized Forli. Malatesta was laying claim to Rimini. The inhabitants of Imola had assassinated their governor, and the town was divided between two opinions: one that it should be put into the hands of the Riani, the other into the hands of the church. Faenza had remained loyal longer than any other place, but at last, losing hope of seeing Caesar recover his power, it had summoned Francesco, a natural son of Galeotto Manfredi, the last surviving heir of this unhappy family, all whose legitimate descendants had been massacred by Borgia. It is true that the fortresses of these different places had taken no part in these revolutions, and had remained immutably faithful to the Duke of Valentinois. So it was not precisely the defection of these towns, which, thanks to their fortresses, might be reconquered, that was the cause of uneasiness to Caesar and Julius II. It was the difficult situation that Venice had thrust upon them. Venice, in the spring of the same year, had signed a treaty of peace with the Turks. Thus set free from her eternal enemy, she had just led her forces to the Romagna, which she had always coveted. These troops had been led towards Ravenna, the farthermost limit of the papal estates, and put under the command of Giacomo Venieri, who had failed to capture Cesena, and had only failed through the courage of its inhabitants. But this check had been amply compensated by the surrender of the fortresses of Val di Lamani and Faenza, by the capture of Farlim Popoli, and the surrender of Rimini, which Pandolfo Malatesta, its lord, exchanged for the sovereignty of Cittadella in the state of Padua, and for the rank of gentleman of Venice. Then Caesar made a proposition to Julius II. This was to make a momentary cession to the church of his own estates in Romagna, so that the respect felt by the Venetians for the church might save these towns from their aggressors. But, says Guicciardini, Julius II, whose ambition, so natural in sovereign leaders, had not yet extinguished the remains of rectitude, refused to accept the places, afraid of exposing himself to the temptation of keeping them later on, against his promises. But as the case was urgent, he proposed to Caesar that he should leave Rome, embark at Ostia, and cross over to Spezia, where Michelato was to meet him at the head of 100 men at arms and 100 light horse, the only remnant of his magnificent army, thence by land to Ferrara, and from Ferrara to Imola, where, once arrived, he could utter his war cry so loud that it would be heard through the length and breadth of Romagna. This advice being after Caesar's own heart, he accepted it at once. The resolution submitted to the Sacred College was approved, and Caesar left for Ostia, accompanied by Bartolomeo della Rovere, nephew of His Holiness. Caesar at last felt he was free, and fancied himself already on his good charger, a second time carrying war into all the places where he had formerly fought. When he reached Ostia, he was met by the cardinals of Sorrento and Volterra, who came in the name of Julius II to ask him to give up the very same citadels which he had refused 3 days before. The fact was that the Pope had learned in the interim that the Venetians had made fresh aggressions, and recognized that the method proposed by Caesar was the only one that would check them. But this time it was Caesar's turn to refuse, for he was weary of these tergiversations and feared a trap. So he said that the surrender asked for would be useless, since by God's help he should be in Romagna before 8 days were past. So the cardinals of Sorrento and Volterra returned to Rome with the refusal. The next morning, just as Caesar was setting foot on his vessel, he was arrested in the name of Julius II. He thought at first that this was the end. He was used to this mode of action, and knew how short was the space between a prison and a tomb. The matter was all the easier in his case, because the Pope, if he chose, would have plenty of pretext for making a case against him. But the heart of Julius was of another kind from his, swift to anger but open to clemency. So, when the Duke came back to Rome guarded, the momentary irritation his refusal had caused was already calmed, and the Pope received him in his usual fashion at his palace, and with his ordinary courtesy, although from the beginning it was easy for the Duke to see that he was being watched. In return for this kind of reception, Caesar consented to yield the fortress of Casenna to the Pope, as being a town which had once belonged to the Church, and now should return. Giving the deed, signed by Caesar, to one of his captains, called Pietro de Oviedo, he ordered him to take possession of the fortress in the name of the Holy See. Pietro obeyed, and starting at once for Casenna, presented himself armed with his warrant before Don Diego Chinon, a noble condottiere of Spain, who was holding the fortress in Caesar's name. But when he had read over the paper that Pietro de Oviedo brought, Don Diego replied that as he knew his lord and master was a prisoner, it would be disgraceful in him to obey an order that had probably been wrested from him by violence, and that the bearer deserved to die for undertaking such a cowardly office. He therefore bade his soldiers seize de Oviedo and flung him down from the top of the walls. This sentence was promptly executed. This mark of fidelity might have proved fatal to Caesar. When the Pope heard how his messenger had been treated, he flew into such a rage that the prisoner thought a second time that his hour was come, and in order to receive his liberty, he made the first of those new propositions to Julius II, which were drawn up in the form of a treaty and sanctioned by a bull. By these arrangements, the Duke of Valentinois was bound to hand over to His Holiness, within the space of 40 days, the fortresses of Casenna and Bertinoro, and authorized the surrender of Forli. This arrangement was guaranteed by 2 bankers in Rome who were responsible for 15,000 ducats, the sum total of the expenses which the governor pretended he had incurred in the place on the Duke's account. The Pope, on his part, engaged to send Caesar to Ostia, under the sole guard of the Cardinal of Santa Croce and 2 officers, who were to give him his full liberty on the very day when his engagements were fulfilled. Should this not happen, Caesar was to be taken to Rome and imprisoned in the castle of Sant'Angelo. In fulfillment of this treaty, Caesar went down the Tiber as far as Ostia, accompanied by the Pope's treasurer and many of his servants. The Cardinal of Santa Croce followed, and the next day joined him there. But as Caesar feared that Julius II might keep him a prisoner, in spite of his pledged word after he had yielded up the fortresses, he asked, through the mediation of Cardinals Borgia and Remolina, who, not feeling safe at Rome, had retired to Naples, for a safe conduct to Gonzalvo of Cordova, and for 2 ships to take him there. With the return of the courier the safe conduct arrived, announcing that the ships would shortly follow. In the midst of all this, the Cardinal of Santa Croce, learning that by the Duke's orders, the governors of Casenna and Bertinoro had surrendered their fortresses to the captains of His Holiness, relaxed his rigor, and knowing that his prisoner would some day or other be free, began to let him go out without a guard. Then Caesar, feeling some fear lest when he started with Gonzalvo's ships the same thing might happen as on the occasion of his embarking on the Pope's vessel, that is, that he might be arrested a second time, concealed himself in a house outside the town, and when night came on, mounting a wretched horse that belonged to a peasant, rode as far as Nettuno, and there hired a little boat, in which he embarked for Monte Dragone, and thence gained Naples. Gonzalvo received him with such joy that Caesar was deceived as to his intention, and this time believed that he was really saved. His confidence was redoubled when, opening his designs to Gonzalvo, and telling him that he counted upon gaining Pisa and thence going on into Romagna, Gonzalvo allowed him to recruit as many soldiers at Naples as he pleased, promising him 2 ships to embark with. Caesar, deceived by these appearances, stopped nearly 6 weeks at Naples, every day seeing the Spanish governor and discussing his plans. But Gonzalvo was only waiting to gain time to tell the King of Spain that his enemy was in his hands, and Caesar actually went to the castle to bid Gonzalvo goodbye, thinking he was about to start after he had embarked his men on the 2 ships. The Spanish governor received him with his accustomed courtesy, wished him every kind of prosperity, and embraced him as he left. But at the door of the castle, Caesar found one of Gonzalvo's captains, Nuno Capahea by name, who arrested him as a prisoner of Ferdinand the Catholic. Caesar at these words heaved a deep sigh, cursing the ill luck that had made him trust the word of an enemy when he had so often broken his own. He was at once taken to the castle, where the prison gate closed behind him, and he felt no hope that anyone would come to his aid, for the only being who was devoted to him in this world was Michelato, and he had heard that Michelato had been arrested near Pisa by order of Julius II. While Caesar was being taken to prison, an officer came to him to deprive him of the safe conduct given him by Gonzalvo. The day after his arrest, which occurred on the 27th of May, 1504, Caesar was taken aboard a ship, which at once weighed anchor and set sail for Spain. During the whole voyage he had but 1 page to serve him, and as soon as he disembarked he was taken to the castle of Medina del Campo. 10 years later, Gonzalvo, who at that time was himself proscribed, owned to Loxa on his dying bed that now, when he was to appear in the presence of God, 2 things weighed cruelly on his conscience. One was his treason to Ferdinand, the other his breach of faith towards Caesar. End of section 26.
Section 27 of Celebrated Crimes, Volume 1. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Celebrated Crimes, Volume 1 by Alexandre Dumas. Translated by G.B. Ives. Section 27, The Borgias, Chapter 16. Cæsar was in prison for 2 years, always hoping that Louis XII would reclaim him as peer of the kingdom of France. But Louis, much disturbed by the loss of the battle of Garigliano, which robbed him of the kingdom of Naples, had enough to do with his own affairs without busying himself with his cousins. So the prisoner was beginning to despair, when one day, as he broke his bread at breakfast, he found a phial and a little bottle containing a narcotic, with a letter from Michelato, saying that he was out of prison and had left Italy for Spain, and now lay in hiding with the Count of Benevento in the neighboring village. He added that from the next day forward he and the Count would wait every night on the road between the fortress and the village with 3 excellent horses. It was now Cæsar's part to do the best he could with his bottle and phial. When the whole world had abandoned the Duke of Romagna, he had been remembered by a sbirro. The prison where he had been shut up for 2 years was so hateful to Cæsar that he lost not a single moment. The same day he attacked one of the bars of a window that looked out upon an inner court, and soon contrived so to manipulate it that it would need only a final push to come out. But not only was the window nearly 70 feet from the ground, but one could only get out of the court by using an exit reserved for the governor, of which he alone had the key. Also, this key never left him. By day it hung at his waist, by night it was under his pillow. This, then, was the chief difficulty. But, prisoner though he was, Caesar had always been treated with the respect due to his name and rank. Every day at the dinner hour he was conducted from the room that served as his prison to the governor, who did the honors of the table in a grand and courteous fashion. The fact was that Don Manuel had served with honor under King Ferdinand, and therefore, while he guarded Caesar rigorously according to orders, he had a great respect for so brave a general, and took pleasure in listening to the accounts of his battles. So he had often insisted that Caesar should not only dine, but also breakfast with him. Happily the prisoner, yielding perhaps to some presentiment, had till now refused this favor. This was of great advantage to him, since, thanks to his solitude, he had been able to receive the instruments of escape sent by Micheloto. The same day he received them, Caesar, on going back to his room, made a false step and sprained his foot. At the dinner hour he tried to go down, but pretended to be suffering so cruelly that he gave it up. The governor came to see him in his room, and found him stretched upon the bed. The day after he was no better. The governor had his dinner sent in, and came to see him as on the night before. He found his prisoner so dejected and gloomy in his solitude that he offered to come and sup with him. Caesar gratefully accepted. This time it was the prisoner who did the honors. Caesar was charmingly courteous. The governor thought he would profit by this lack of restraint to put to him certain questions as to the manner of his arrest, and asked him, as an old Castilian, for whom honor is still of some account, what the truth really was as to Gonzalvo's and Ferdinand's breach of faith with him. Caesar appeared extremely inclined to give him his entire confidence, but showed by a sign that the attendants were in the way. This precaution appeared quite natural, and the governor took no offense, but hastened to send them all away, so as to be the sooner alone with his companion. When the door was shut, Caesar filled his glass and the governor's, proposing the king's health. The governor honored the toast. Caesar at once began his tale, but he had scarcely uttered a third part of it when, interesting as it was, the eyes of his host shut as though by magic, and he slid under the table in a profound sleep. After half an hour had passed, the servants, hearing no noise, entered and found the two, one on the table, the other under it. This event was not so extraordinary that they paid any great attention to it. All they did was to carry Don Manuel to his room and lift Caesar on the bed. Then they put away the remnant of the meal for the next day's supper, shut the door very carefully, and left their prisoner alone. Caesar stayed for a minute motionless, and apparently plunged in the deepest sleep. But when he heard the steps retreating, he quietly raised his head, opened his eyes, slipped off the bed, walked to the door, slowly indeed, but not to all appearance feeling the accident of the night before, and applied his ear for some minutes to the keyhole. Then, lifting his head with an expression of indescribable pride, he wiped his brow with his hand, and for the first time since his guards went out, breathed freely with full-drawn breaths. There was no time to lose. His first care was to shut the door as securely on the inside as it was already shut on the outside, to blow out the lamp, to open the window, and to finish sawing through the bar. When this was done, he undid the bandages on his leg, took down the window and bed curtains, tore them into strips, joined the sheets, table napkins, and cloth, and with all these things tied together end to end, formed a rope 50 or 60 feet long, with knots every here and there. This rope he fixed securely to the bar next to the one he had just cut through. Then he climbed up to the window and began what was really the hardest part of his perilous enterprise, clinging with hands and feet to this fragile support. Luckily he was both strong and skilful, and he went down the whole length of the rope without accident. But when he reached the end, and was hanging on the last knot, he sought in vain to touch the ground with his feet. His rope was too short. The situation was a terrible one. The darkness of the night prevented the fugitive from seeing how far off he was from the ground, and his fatigue prevented him from even attempting to climb up again. Cæsar put up a brief prayer, whether to God or Satan he alone could say. Then, letting go the rope, he dropped from a height of 12 or 15 feet. The danger was too great for the fugitive to trouble about a few trifling contusions. He at once rose, and guiding himself by the direction of his window, he went straight to the little door of exit. He then put his hand into the pocket of his doublet, and a cold sweat damped his brow. Either he had forgotten and left it in his room, or had lost it in his fall. Anyhow, he had not the key. But summoning his recollections, he quite gave up the first idea for the second, which was the only likely one. Again he crossed the court, looking for the place where the key might have fallen, by the aid of the wall round a tank on which he had laid his hand when he got up. But the object of search was so small, and the night so dark, that there was little chance of getting any result. Still Cæsar sought for it, for in this key was his last hope. Suddenly a door was opened, and a night watch appeared, preceded by 2 torches. Cæsar for the moment thought he was lost, but remembering the tank behind him, he dropped into it, and with nothing but his head above water, anxiously watched the movements of the soldiers as they advanced beside him, passed only a few feet away, crossed the court, and then disappeared by an opposite door. But short as their luminous apparition had been, it had lighted up the ground, and Cæsar, by the glare of the torches, had caught the glitter of the long-sought key, and as soon as the door was shut behind the men, was again master of his liberty. Halfway between the castle and the village, 2 cavaliers and a led horse were waiting for him. The 2 men were Micheletto and the Count of Benevento. Cæsar sprang upon the riderless horse, pressed with fervor the hand of the Count and the sbirro, then all 3 galloped to the frontier of Navarre, where they arrived 3 days later, and were honorably received by the king, Jean d'Albret, the brother of Cæsar's wife. From Navarre he thought to pass into France, and from France to make an attempt upon Italy with the aid of Louis XII. But during Cæsar's detention in the castle of Medina del Campo, Louis had made peace with the King of Spain; and when he heard of Cæsar's flight, instead of helping him, as there was some reason to expect he would, since he was a relative by marriage, he took away the Duchy of Valentinois and also his pension. Still, Cæsar had nearly 200,000 ducats in the charge of bankers at Genoa. He wrote asking for this sum, with which he hoped to levy troops in Spain and in Navarre, and make an attempt upon Pisa. 500 men, 200,000 ducats, his name and his word were more than enough to save him from despair. The bankers denied the deposit. Cæsar was at the mercy of his brother-in-law. One of the vassals of the King of Navarre, named Prince Alarino, had just then revolted. Cæsar then took command of the army which Jean d'Albret was sending out against him, followed by Micheletto, who was as faithful in adversity as ever before. Thanks to Cæsar's courage and skilful tactics, Prince Alarino was beaten in a first encounter. But the day after his defeat he rallied his army, and offered battle about 3 o'clock in the afternoon. Cæsar accepted it. For nearly 4 hours they fought obstinately on both sides, but at length, as the day was going down, Cæsar proposed to decide the issue by making a charge himself, at the head of 100 men-at-arms, upon a body of cavalry which made his adversary's chief force. To his great astonishment, this cavalry at the first shock gave way and took flight in the direction of a little wood, where they seemed to be seeking refuge. Caesar followed close on their heels up to the edge of the forest. Then suddenly the pursued turned right about face. 300 or 400 archers came out of the wood to help them, and Caesar's men, seeing that they had fallen into an ambush, took to their heels like cowards, and abandoned their leader. Left alone, Caesar would not budge one step. Possibly he had had enough of life, and his heroism was rather the result of satiety than courage. However that may be, he defended himself like a lion, but, riddled with arrows and bolts, his horse at last fell, with Caesar's leg under him. His adversaries rushed upon him, and one of them, thrusting a sharp and slender iron pike through a weak place in his armor, pierced his breast. Caesar cursed God and died. But the rest of the enemy's army was defeated, thanks to the courage of Micheloto, who fought like a valiant condottiere, but learned, on returning to the camp in the evening, from those who had fled, that they had abandoned Caesar, and that he had never reappeared. Then only too certain from his master's well-known courage that disaster had occurred, he desired to give one last proof of his devotion by not leaving his body to the wolves and birds of prey. Torches were lighted, for it was dark, and with 10 or 12 of those who had gone with Caesar as far as the little wood, he went to seek his master. On reaching the spot they pointed out, he beheld 5 men stretched side by side. 4 of them were dressed, but the 5th had been stripped of his clothing and lay completely naked. Micheloto dismounted, lifted the head upon his knees, and by the light of the torches recognized Caesar. Thus fell, on the 10th of March, 1507, on an unknown field near an obscure village called Viane, in a wretched skirmish with the vassal of a petty king, the man whom Machiavelli presents to all princes as the model of ability, diplomacy, and courage. As to Lucrezia, the fair Duchess of Ferrara, she died full of years and honors, adored as a queen by her subjects, and sung as a goddess by Ariosto and by Bembo. End of section 27.
Section 28 of Celebrated Crimes, Volume 1. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Celebrated Crimes, Volume 1 by Alexandre Dumas. Translated by G.B. Ives. Section 28. Epilogue. There was once in Paris, says Boccaccio, a brave and good merchant named Jean de Cenci, who did a great trade in drapery, and was connected in business with a neighbour and fellow merchant, a very rich man called Abraham, who, though a Jew, enjoyed a good reputation. Jean de Cenci, appreciating the qualities of the worthy Israelite, feared lest, good man as he was, his false religion would bring his soul straight to eternal perdition. So he began to urge him, gently as a friend, to renounce his errors and open his eyes to the Christian faith, which he could see for himself was prospering and spreading day by day, being the only true and good religion, whereas his own creed, it was very plain, was so quickly diminishing that it would soon disappear from the face of the earth. The Jew replied that except in his own religion there was no salvation, that he was born in it, proposed to live and die in it, and that he knew nothing in the world that could change his opinion. Still, in his proselytizing fervour, Jean would not think himself beaten, and never a day passed but he demonstrated with those fair words the merchant uses to seduce a customer, the superiority of the Christian religion above the Jewish. And although Abraham was a great master of Mosaic law, he began to enjoy his friend's preaching, either because of the friendship he felt for him, or because the Holy Ghost descended upon the tongue of the new apostle. Still obstinate in his own belief, he would not change. The more he persisted in his error, the more excited was Jean about converting him, so that at last, by God's help, being somewhat shaken by his friend's urgency, Abraham one day said, Listen, Jean, since you have it so much at heart that I should be converted, behold me disposed to satisfy you. But before I go to Rome to see him who you call God's vicar on earth, I must study his manner of life and his morals, as also those of his brethren the cardinals. And if, as I doubt not, they are in harmony with what you preach, I will admit that, as you have taken such pains to show me, your faith is better than mine, and I will do as you desire. But if I should prove otherwise, I shall remain a Jew, as I was before. For it is not worth while at my age to change my belief for a worse one. Jean was very sad when he heard these words, and he was mournful to himself. Now I have lost my time and pains, which I thought I had spent so well when I was hoping to convert this unhappy Abraham. For if he unfortunately goes, as he says he will, to the court of Rome, and there sees the shameful life led by the servants of the church, instead of becoming a Christian, the Jew will be more of a Jew than ever. Then turning to Abraham, he said, Ah, friend, why do you wish to incur such fatigue and expense by going to Rome, besides the fact that travelling by sea or by land must be very dangerous for so rich a man as you are? Do you suppose there is no one here to baptize you? If you have any doubts concerning the faith I have expounded, where better than here will you find theologians capable of contending with them and allaying them? So you see, this voyage seems to me quite unnecessary. Just imagine that the priests there are such as you see here, and all the better in that they are nearer to the supreme pastor. If you are guided by my advice, you will postpone this toil till you have committed some grave sin and need absolution. Then you and I will go together. But the Jew replied, I believe, dear Jean, that everything is as you tell me, but you know how obstinate I am. I will go to Rome, or I will never be a Christian. Then Jean, seeing his great wish, resolved that it was no use trying to thwart him, and wished him good luck. But in his heart he gave up all hope, for it was certain that his friend would come back from his pilgrimage more of a Jew than ever, if the court of Rome was still as he had seen it. But Abraham mounted his horse, and at his best speed took the road to Rome, where, on his arrival, he was wonderfully well received by his co-religionists, and after staying there a good long time, he began to study the behaviour of the Pope, the cardinals, and other prelates, and of the whole court. But much to his surprise, he found out, partly by what passed under his eyes, and partly by what he was told, that all from the Pope downward to the lowest sacristan of St. Peter's were committing the sins of luxurious living in a most disgraceful and unbridled manner, with no remorse and no shame, so that pretty women and handsome youths could obtain any favours they pleased. In addition to this sensuality which they exhibited in public, he saw that they were gluttons and drunkards, so much so that they were more the slaves of the belly than are the greediest of animals. When he looked a little further, he found them so avaricious and fond of money that they sold for hard cash both human bodies and divine offices, and with less conscience than a man in Paris would sell cloth or any other merchandise. Seeing this, and much more that it would not be proper to set down here, it seemed to Abraham, himself a chaste, sober, and upright man, that he had seen enough. So he resolved to return to Paris, and carried out the resolution with his usual promptitude. Jean de Cenci held a great fête in honour of his return, although he had lost hope of his coming back converted. But he left time for him to settle down before he spoke of anything, thinking there would be plenty of time to hear the bad news he expected. But after a few days of rest, Abraham himself came to see his friend, and Jean ventured to ask what he thought of the Holy Father, the cardinals, and the other persons at the pontifical court. At these words the Jew exclaimed, God damn them all! I never once succeeded in finding among them any holiness, any devotion, any good works, but, on the contrary, luxurious living, avarice, greed, fraud, envy, pride, and even worse, if there is worse, all the machine seemed to be set in motion by an impulse less divine than diabolical. After what I saw, it is my firm conviction that your Pope, and of course the others as well, are using all their talents, art, endeavours to banish the Christian religion from the face of the earth. though they ought to be its foundation and support. And since, in spite of all the care and trouble they expend to arrive at this end, I see that your religion is spreading every day and becoming more brilliant and more pure, it is borne in upon me that the Holy Spirit himself protects it as the only true and the most holy religion. This is why, deaf as you found me to your counsel and rebellious to your wish, I am now, ever since I returned from this Sodom, firmly resolved on becoming a Christian. So let us go at once to the church, for I am quite ready to be baptized. There is no need to say if Jean de Sévigné, who expected a refusal, was pleased at this consent. Without delay he went with his godson to Notre Dame de Paris, where he prayed the first priest he met to administer baptism to his friend, and this was speedily done, and the new convert changed his Jewish name of Abraham into the Christian name of Jean, and as the neophyte, thanks to his journey to Rome, had gained a profound belief, his natural good qualities increased so greatly in the practice of our holy religion, that after leading an exemplary life he died in the full order of sanctity. This tale of Boccaccio's gives so admirable an answer to the charge of irreligion which some might make against us if they mistook our intentions, that, as we shall not offer any other reply, we have not hesitated to present it entire as it stands to the eyes of our readers. And let us never forget that if the papacy has had an Innocent VIII and an Alexander VI, who are in its shame, it also has a Pius and a Gregory XVI, who are in its honour and glory. End of section 28.
Section 29 of Celebrated Crimes, Volume 1. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Miriam Esther Goldman. Celebrated Crimes, Volume 1, by Alexandre Dumas. Translated by G.B. Ives. Section 29. The Cenci, Part 1. The Cenci, 1598, by Alexandre Dumas, Père. Should you ever go to Rome and visit the Villa Pamphili, no doubt, after having sought under its tall pines and along its canal the shade and freshness so rare in the capital of the Christian world, you will descend towards the Janiculum Hill by a charming road, in the middle of which you will find the Pauline Fountain. Having passed this monument, and having lingered a moment on the terrace of the Church of St. Peter Montorio, which commands the whole of Rome, you will find the cloister of Bramante, in the middle of which, sunk a few feet below the level, is built, on the identical place where St. Peter was crucified, a little temple, half Greek, half Christian. You will thence ascend by a side door into the church itself. There the attentive Cicerone will show you, in the first chapel to the right, the Christ Scourged, by Sebastian del Piombo, and in the third chapel to the left, an entombment by Fiammingo. Having examined these two masterpieces at leisure, he will take you to each end of the transverse cross, and will show you on one side a picture by Salviati on slate, and on the other a work by Vasari. Then, pointing out in melancholy tones a copy of Guido's Martyrdom of St. Peter on the high altar, he will relate to you how, for 3 centuries, the divine Raphael's Transfiguration was worshipped in that spot, how it was carried away by the French in 1809, and restored to the Pope by the Allies in 1814. As you have already in all probability admired this masterpiece in the Vatican, allow him to expatiate and search at the foot of the altar for a mortuary slab, which you will identify by a cross and a single word, Orate. Under this gravestone is buried Beatrice Cenci, whose tragical story cannot but impress you profoundly. She was the daughter of Francesco Cenci. Whether or not it be true that men are born in harmony with their epoch, and that some embody its good qualities and others its bad ones, it may nevertheless interest our readers to cast a rapid glance over the period which had just passed when the events which we are about to relate took place. Francesco Cenci will then appear to them as the diabolical incarnation of his time. On the 11th of August, 1492, after the lingering death agony of Innocent VIII, during which 220 murders were committed in the streets of Rome, Alexander VI ascended to the pontifical throne. Son of a sister of Pope Calixtus III, Rodrigo Lenzuoli Borgia, before being created cardinal, had 5 children by Rosa Vanozza, whom he afterwards caused to be married to a rich Roman. These children were Francis, Duke of Gandia; Caesar, Bishop and Cardinal, afterwards Duke of Valentinois; Lucrezia, who was married 4 times. Her first husband was Giovanni Sforza, Lord of Pesaro, whom she left owing to his impotence; the second, Alfonso, Duke of Bisilia, whom her brother Caesar caused to be assassinated; the third, Alfonso d'Este, Duke of Ferrara, from whom a second divorce separated her; finally, the fourth, Alfonso of Aragon, who was stabbed to death on the steps of the Basilica of St. Peter, and afterwards, 3 weeks later, strangled, because he did not die soon enough from his wounds, which nevertheless were mortal. Geoffrey, Count of Squillace, of whom little is known, and finally a youngest son, of whom nothing at all is known. The most famous of these 3 brothers was Caesar Borgia. He had made every arrangement a plotter could make to be king of Italy at the death of his father the Pope, and his measures were so carefully taken as to leave no doubt in his own mind as to the success of this vast project. Every chance was provided against, except one, but Satan himself could hardly have foreseen this particular one. The reader will judge for himself. The Pope had invited Cardinal Adrian to supper in his vineyard on the Belvedere. Cardinal Adrian was very rich, and the Pope wished to inherit his wealth, as he already had acquired that of the Cardinals of Sant'Angelo, Capua, and Modena. To effect this, Caesar Borgia sent 2 bottles of poisoned wine to his father's cupbearer, without taking him into his confidence. He only instructed him not to serve this wine till he himself gave orders to do so. Unfortunately, during supper, the cupbearer left his post for a moment, and in this interval a careless butler served the poisoned wine to the Pope, to Caesar Borgia, and to Cardinal Cornetto. Alexander VI died some hours afterwards. Caesar Borgia was confined to bed and sloughed off his skin, while Cardinal Cornetto lost his sight and his senses and was brought to death's door. Pius III succeeded Alexander VI and reigned 25 days. On the 26th, he was poisoned also. Caesar Borgia had under his control 18 Spanish cardinals, who owed to them their places in the Sacred College. These cardinals were entirely his creatures, and he could command them absolutely. As he was in a moribund condition and could make no use of them for himself, he sold them to Giuliano della Rovere, and Giuliano della Rovere was elected pope under the name of Julius II. To the Rome of Nero succeeded the Athens of Pericles. Leo X succeeded Julius II, and under his pontificate Christianity assumed a pagan character, which, passing from art into manners, gives to this epoch a strange complexion. Crimes for the moment disappeared, to give place to vices, but to charming vices, vices in good taste, such as those indulged in by Alcibiades and sung by Catullus. Leo X died after having assembled under his reign, which lasted 8 years, 8 months, and 19 days, Michelangelo, Raphael, Leonardo da Vinci, Correggio, Titian, Andrea del Sarto, Fra Bartolomeo, Giulio Romano, Ariosto, Guicciardini, and Machiavelli. Giulio de' Medici and Pompeo Colonna were again rival candidates. Intrigues recommenced, and the conclave was once more so divided that at one time the cardinals thought they could only escape the difficulty in which they were placed by doing what they had done before, and electing a third competitor. They were even talking about Cardinal Orsini when Giulio de' Medici, one of the rival candidates, hit upon a very ingenious expedient. He wanted only 5 votes. 5 of his partisans each offered to bet 5 of Colonna's 100,000 ducats to 10,000 against the election of Giulio de' Medici. At the very first ballot after the wager, Giulio de' Medici got the 5 votes he wanted. No objection could be made. The cardinals had not been bribed; they had made a bet, that was all. Thus it happened. On the 18th of November, 1523, Giulio de' Medici was proclaimed Pope under the name of Clement VII. That same day he generously paid the 500,000 ducats which his 5 partisans had lost. It was under this pontificate, and during the 7 months in which Rome, conquered by the Lutheran soldiers of the Constable of Bourbon, saw holy things subjected to the most frightful profanations, that Francesco Cenci was born. He was the son of Monsignor Niccolo Cenci, afterwards apostolic treasurer during the pontificate of Pius V. Under this venerable prelate, who occupied himself much more with the spiritual than the temporal administration of his kingdom, Niccolo Cenci took advantage of his spiritual head's abstraction of worldly matters to amass a net revenue of 160,000 piastres, about £32,000 of our money. Francesco Cenci, who was his only son, inherited this fortune. His youth was spent under popes so occupied with the schism of Luther that they had no time to think of anything else. The result was that Francesco Cenci, inheriting vicious instincts and master of an immense fortune which enabled him to purchase immunity, abandoned himself to all the evil passions of his fiery and passionate temperament. 5 times during his profligate career, imprisoned for abominable crimes, he only succeeded in procuring his liberation by the payment of 200,000 piastres, or about 1,000,000 francs. It should be explained that popes at this time were in great need of money. The lawless profligacy of Francesco Cenci first began seriously to attract public attention under the pontificate of Gregory XIII. This reign offered marvelous facilities for the development of a reputation such as that which this reckless Italian Don Juan seemed bent on acquiring. Under the Bolognese Buoncampo, a free hand was given to those able to pay both assassins and judges. Rape and murder were so common that public justice scarcely troubled itself with these trifling things if nobody appeared to prosecute the guilty parties. The good Gregory had his reward for his easy-going indulgence. He was spared to rejoice over the massacre of St. Bartholomew. Francesco Cenci was at the time of which we are speaking a man of 45 years of age, about 5 feet 4 inches in height, symmetrically proportioned and very strong, although rather thin. His hair was streaked with gray. His eyes were large and expressive, although the upper eyelids drooped somewhat. His nose was long, his lips were thin, and wore habitually a pleasant smile, except when his eye perceived an enemy. At this moment his features assumed a terrible expression, and on such occasions, and whenever moved or even slightly irritated, he was seized with a fit of nervous trembling, which lasted long after the cause which provoked it had passed. An adept in all manly exercises, and especially in horsemanship, he sometimes used to ride without stopping from Rome to Naples, a distance of 41 leagues, passing through the forests of San Germano and the Pontine marshes, heedless of brigands, although he might be alone and unarmed save for his sword and dagger. When his horse fell from fatigue, he bought another. Were the owner unwilling to sell, he took it by force. If resistance were made, he struck, and always with the point, never the hilt. In most cases, being well known throughout the Papal States as a free-handed person, nobody tried to thwart him, some yielding through fear, others from motives of interest. Impious, sacrilegious, and atheistical, he never entered a church except to profane its sanctity. It was said of him that he had a morbid appetite for novelties in crime, and that there was no outrage he would not commit if he hoped by so doing to enjoy a new sensation. At the age of about 45 he had married a very rich woman, whose name is not mentioned by any chronicler. She died, leaving him 7 children, 5 boys and 2 girls. He then married Lucrezia Petroni, a perfect beauty of the Roman type, except for the ivory pallor of her complexion. By this second marriage he had no children. As if Francesco Cenci were void of all natural affection, he hated his children, and was at no pains to conceal his feelings towards them. On one occasion, when he was building in the courtyard of his magnificent palace near the Tiber a chapel dedicated to St. Thomas, he remarked to the architect, when instructing him to design a family vault, "That is where I hope to bury them all." The architect often subsequently admitted that he was so terrified by the fiendish laugh which accompanied these words, that had not Francesco Cenci's work been extremely profitable, he would have refused to go on with it. As soon as his 3 eldest boys, Giacomo, Cristoforo, and Rocco, were out of their tutor's hands, in order to get rid of them he sent them to the University of Salamanca, where, out of sight, they were out of mind, for he thought no more about them, and did not even send them the means of subsistence. In these straits, after struggling for some months against their wretched plight, the lads were obliged to leave Salamanca and beg their way home, tramping barefoot through France and Italy, till they made their way back to Rome, where they found their father harsher and more unkind than ever. End of section 29. Recording by Miriam Esther Goldman.
Section 30 of Celebrated Crimes, Volume 1. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Stephen Carney. Celebrated Crimes, Volume 1 by Alexandre Dumas. Translated by G.B. Ives. Section 30. The Cenci, Part 2. This happened in the early part of the reign of Clement VIII, famed for his justice. The 3 youths resolved to apply to him to grant them an allowance after their father's immense income. They consequently repaired to Frascati, where the Pope was building the beautiful Aldobrandini villa, and stated their case. The Pope admitted the justice of their claims, and ordered Francesco to allow each of them 2,000 crowns a year. He endeavored by every possible means to evade this decree, but the Pope's orders were too stringent to be disobeyed. About this period he was for the 3rd time imprisoned for infamous crimes. His 3 sons then again petitioned the Pope, alleging that their father dishonored the family name, and praying that the extreme rigor of the law, a capital sentence, should be enforced in his case. The Pope pronounced this conduct unnatural and odious, and drove them with ignominy from his presence. As for Francesco, he escaped, as on the 2 previous occasions, by the payment of a large sum of money. It will be readily understood that his sons' conduct on this occasion did not improve their father's disposition towards them, but as their independent pensions enabled them to keep out of his way, his rage fell with all the greater intensity on his 2 unhappy daughters. Their situation soon became so intolerable that the elder, contriving to elude the close supervision under which she was kept, forwarded to the Pope a petition relating the cruel treatment to which she was subjected, and praying His Holiness either to give her in marriage or place her in a convent. Clement VIII took pity on her, compelled Francesco Cenci to give her a dowry of 60,000 crowns, and married her to Carlo Gabrielli, of a noble family of Gubbio. Francesco was driven nearly frantic with rage when he saw this victim released from his clutches. About the same time, death relieved him from 2 other encumbrances. His sons Rocco and Cristoforo were killed within a year of each other, the latter by a bungling medical practitioner whose name is unknown, the former by a Paolo Corso di Massa in the streets of Rome. This came as a relief to Francesco, whose avarice pursued his sons even after their death, for he intimated to the priest that he would not spend a farthing on funeral services. They were accordingly borne to the paupers' graves, which he had caused to be prepared for them, and when he saw them both interred, he cried out that he was well rid of such good-for-nothing children, but that he should be perfectly happy only when the remaining 5 were buried with the first 2, and that when he had got rid of the last, he himself would burn down his palace as a bonfire to celebrate the event. But Francesco took every precaution against his second daughter, Beatrice Cenci, following the example of her elder sister. She was then a child of 12 or 13 years of age, beautiful and innocent as an angel, her long fair hair, a beauty seen so rarely in Italy that Raffaele, believing it divine, has appropriated it to all his Madonnas, curtained a lovely forehead, and fell in flowing locks over her shoulders. Her azure eyes bore a heavenly expression. She was of middle height, exquisitely proportioned, and during the rare moments when a gleam of happiness allowed her natural character to display itself, she was lively, joyous, and sympathetic, but at the same time evinced a firm and decided disposition. To make sure of her custody, Francesco kept her shut up in a remote apartment of his palace, the key of which he kept in his own possession. There her unnatural and inflexible jailer daily brought her some food. Up to the age of 13, which he had now reached, he had behaved to her with the most extreme harshness and severity, but now, to poor Beatrice's great astonishment, he all at once became gentle and even tender. Beatrice was a child no longer, her beauty expanded like a flower, and Francesco, a stranger to no crime, however heinous, had marked her for his own. Brought up as she had been, uneducated, deprived of all society, even that of her stepmother, Beatrice knew not good from evil. Her ruin was comparatively easy to compass. Yet Francesco, to accomplish his diabolical purpose, employed all the means at his command. Every night she was awakened by a concert of music which seemed to come from paradise. When she mentioned this to her father, he left her in this belief, adding that if she proved gentle and obedient, she would be rewarded by heavenly sights, as well as heavenly sounds. One night it came to pass that as the young girl was reposing, her head supported on her elbow, and listening to a delightful harmony, the chamber door suddenly opened, and from the darkness of her own room she beheld a suite of apartments brilliantly illuminated and sensuous with perfumes. Beautiful youths and girls, half-clad, such as she had seen in the pictures of Guido and Raffaele, moved to and fro in these apartments, seeming full of joy and happiness. These were the ministers to the pleasures of Francesco, who, rich as a king, every night revelled in the orgies of Alexander, the wedding revels of Lucrezia, and the excesses of Tiberius at Capri. After an hour the door closed, and the seductive vision vanished, leaving Beatrice full of trouble and amazement. The night following, the same apparition again presented itself, only on this occasion Francesco Cenci, undressed, entered his daughter's room and invited her to join the fete. Hardly knowing what she did, Beatrice yet perceived the impropriety of yielding to her father's wishes. She replied that not seeing her stepmother, Lucrezia Petroni, among all these women, she dared not leave her bed to mix with persons who were unknown to her. Francesco threatened and prayed, but threats and prayer were of no avail. Beatrice wrapped herself up in the bedclothes and obstinately refused to obey. The next night she threw herself on her bed without undressing. At the accustomed hour, the door opened, and the nocturnal spectacle reappeared. This time Lucrezia Petroni was among the women who passed before Beatrice's door. Violence had compelled her to undergo this humiliation. Beatrice was too far off to see her blushes and her tears. Francesco pointed out to her stepmother, whom she had looked for in vain the previous evening. As she could no longer make any opposition, he led her, covered with blushes and confusion, into the middle of this orgy. Beatrice there saw incredible and infamous things. Nevertheless, she resisted a long time. An inward voice told her that this was horrible, but Francesco had the slow persistence of a demon. To these sights, calculated to stimulate her passions, he added heresies designed to warp her mind. He told her that the greatest saints venerated by the Church were the issue of fathers and daughters, and in the bed, Beatrice committed a crime without even knowing it to be sin. His brutality then knew no bounds. He forced Lucrezia and Beatrice to share the same bed, threatening his wife to kill her if she disclosed to his daughter by a single word that there was anything odious in such an intercourse. So matters went on for about 3 years. At this time Francesco was obliged to make a journey and leave the women alone and free. The first thing Lucrezia did was to enlighten Beatrice on the infamy of the life they were leading. They then together prepared a memorial to the Pope, in which they laid before him a statement of all the blows and outrages they had suffered. But before leaving, Francesco Cenci had taken precautions. Every person about the Pope was in his pay, or hoped to be. The petition never reached His Holiness, and the 2 poor women, remembering that Clement VIII had on a former occasion driven Giacomo and Cristoforo and Rocco from his presence, thought they were included in the same prescription, and looked upon themselves as abandoned to their fate. When matters were in this state, Giacomo, taking advantage of his father's absence, came to pay them a visit with a friend of his, an abbé named Guerra. He was a young man of 25 or 26, belonging to one of the most noble families in Rome, of a bold, resolute, and courageous character, and idolized by all the Roman ladies for his beauty. To classical features he added blue eyes swimming in poetic sentiment. His hair was long and fair, with chestnut beard and eyebrows. Add to these attractions a highly educated mind, natural eloquence expressed by a musical and penetrating voice, and the reader may form some idea of Monsignor Abbé de Guerra. No sooner had he seen Beatrice than he fell in love with her. On her side she was not slow to return the sympathy of the young priest. The Council of Trent had not been held at that time, consequently ecclesiastics were not precluded from marriage. It was therefore decided that on the return of Francesco, the Abbé Guerra should demand the hand of Beatrice from her father, and the women, happy in the absence of their master, continued to live on, hoping for better things to come. End of section 30. Section 31 of Celebrated Crimes, Volume 1. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Stephen Carney. Celebrated Crimes, Volume 1 by Alexandre Dumas. Translated by G.B. Ives. Section 31, The Cenci, Part 3. After 3 or 4 months, during which no one knew where he was, Francesco returned. The very first night he wished to resume his intercourse with Beatrice, but she was no longer the same person. The timid and submissive child had become a girl of decided will. Strong in her love for the abbey, she resisted alike prayers, threats, and blows. The wrath of Francesco fell upon his wife, whom he accused of betraying him. He gave her a violent thrashing. Lucrezia Petroni was a veritable Roman she-wolf, passionate alike in love and vengeance. She endured all, but pardoned nothing. Some days after this, the Abbé Guerra arrived at the Cenci palace to carry out what had been arranged. Rich, young, noble, and handsome, everything would seem to promise him success, yet he was rudely dismissed by Francesco. The first refusal did not daunt him. He returned to the charge a second time, and yet a third, insisting upon the suitableness of such a union. At length Francesco, losing patience, told this obstinate lover that a reason existed why Beatrice could be neither his wife nor any other man's. Guerra demanded what this reason was. Francesco replied, "Because she is my mistress." Monsignor Guerra turned pale at this answer, although at first he did not believe a word of it. But when he saw the smile with which Francesco Cenci accompanied his words, he was compelled to believe that, terrible though it was, the truth had been spoken. For 3 days he sought an interview with Beatrice in vain. At length he succeeded in finding her. His last hope was her denial of this horrible story. Beatrice confessed all. Henceforth there was no human hope for the two lovers. An impassable gulf separated them. They parted bathed in tears, promising to love one another always. Up to that time the two women had not formed any criminal resolution, and possibly the tragical incident might never have happened, had not Francesco one night returned into his daughter's room and violently forced her into the commission of fresh crime. Henceforth the doom of Francesco was irrevocably pronounced. As we have said, the mind of Beatrice was susceptible to the best and the worst influences. It could attain excellence and descend to guilt. She went and told her mother of the fresh outrage she had undergone. This roused in the heart of the other woman the sting of her own wrongs, and, stimulating each other's desire for revenge, they decided upon the murder of Francesco. Guerra was called in to this council of death. His heart was a prey to hatred and revenge. He undertook to communicate with Giacomo Cenci, without whose concurrence the women would not act, as he was the head of the family, when his father was left out of account. Giacomo entered readily into the conspiracy. It will be remembered what he had formerly suffered from his father. Since that time he had married, and the close-fisted old man had left him, with his wife and children, to languish in poverty. Guerra's house was selected to meet in and concert matters. Giacomo hired a sbirro named Marzio, and Guerra a second named Olimpio. Both these men had private reasons for committing the crime, one being actuated by love, the other by hatred. Marzio, who was in the service of Giacomo, had often seen Beatrice, and loved her, but with that silent and hopeless love which devours the soul. When he conceived that the proposed crime would draw him nearer to Beatrice, he accepted his part in it without any demur. As for Olimpio, he hated Francesco, because the latter had caused him to lose the post of Castellan of Rocco Petrella, a fortified stronghold in the kingdom of Naples, belonging to Prince Colonna. Almost every year Francesco Cenci spent some months at Rocco Petrella with his family, for Prince Colonna, a noble and magnificent but needy prince, had much esteem for Francesco, whose purse he found extremely useful. It had so happened that Francesco, being dissatisfied with Olimpio, complained about him to Prince Colonna, and he was dismissed. After several consultations between the Cenci family, the abbey, and the sbirri, the following plan of action was decided upon. The period when Francesco Cenci was accustomed to go to Rocco Petrella was approaching. It was arranged that Olimpio, conversant with the district and its inhabitants, should collect a party of 12 Neapolitan bandits and conceal them in a forest through which the travelers would have to pass. Upon a given signal, the whole family were to be seized and carried off. A heavy ransom was to be demanded, and the sons were to be sent back to Rome to raise the sum. But under pretext of inability to do so, they were to allow the time fixed by the bandits to lapse, when Francesco was to be put to death. Thus all suspicions of a plot would be avoided, and the real assassins would escape justice. This well-devised scheme was nevertheless unsuccessful. When Francesco left Rome, the scouts sent in advance by the conspirators could not find the bandits. The latter, not being warned beforehand, failed to come down before the passage of the travelers, who arrived safe and sound at Rocco Petrella. The bandits, after having patrolled the road in vain, came to the conclusion that their prey had escaped, and unwilling to stay any longer in a place where they had already spent a week, went off in quest of better luck elsewhere. Francesco had in the meantime settled down in the fortress, and to be more free to tyrannize over Lucrezia and Beatrice, sent back to Rome Giacomo and his 2 other sons. He then recommenced his infamous attempts upon Beatrice, and with such persistence that she resolved herself to accomplish the deed which at first she desired to entrust to other hands. Olimpio and Marzio, who had nothing to fear from justice, remained lurking about the castle. One day Beatrice saw them from a window, and made signs that she had something to communicate to them. The same night Olimpio, who, having been Castellan, knew all the approaches to the fortress, made his way there with his companion. Beatrice awaited them at a window which looked on to a secluded courtyard. She gave them letters which she had written to her brother and to Monsignor Guerra. The former was to approve, as he had done before, the murder of their father, for she would do nothing without his sanction. As for Monsignor Guerra, he was to pay Olimpio 1,000 piastres, half the stipulated sum. Marzio, acting out of pure love for Beatrice, whom he worshipped as a Madonna, which, observing, the girl gave him a handsome scarlet mantle trimmed with gold lace, telling him to wear it for love of her. As for the remaining moiety, he was to be paid when the death of the old man had placed his wife and daughter in possession of his fortune. The 2 sbirri departed, and the imprisoned conspirators anxiously awaited their return. On the day fixed, they were seen again. Monsignor Guerra had paid the 1,000 piastres, and Giacomo had given his consent. Nothing now stood in the way of the execution of this terrible deed, which was fixed for the 8th of September, the day of the Nativity of the Virgin. But Signora Lucrezia, a very devout person, having noticed this circumstance, would not be a party to the committal of a double sin. The matter was therefore deferred till the next day, the 9th. That evening, the 9th of September, 1598, the 2 women, supping with the old man, mixed some narcotic with his wine so adroitly that, suspicious though he was, he never detected it, and having swallowed the potion, soon fell into a deep sleep. The evening previous, Marzio and Olimpio had been admitted into the castle, where they had lain concealed all night and all day, for, as will be remembered, the assassination would have been effected the day before had it not been for the religious scruples of Signor Lucrezia Petroni. Towards midnight, Beatrice fetched them out of their hiding-place, and took them to her father's chamber, the door of which she herself opened. The assassins entered, and the 2 women awaited the issue in the room adjoining. After a moment, seeing the sbirri reappear, pale and nerveless, shaking their heads without speaking, they at once inferred that nothing had been done. "What is the matter?" cried Beatrice, "and what hinders you?" "It is a cowardly act," replied the assassins, "to kill a poor old man in his sleep. At the thought of his age we were struck with pity." Then Beatrice disdainfully raised her head, and in a deep, firm voice thus reproached them. "Is it possible that you, who pretend to be brave and strong, have not the courage to kill a sleeping old man? How would it be if he were awake, and thus you steal our money? Very well, since your cowardice compels me to do so, I will kill my father myself, but you will not long survive him." Hearing those words, the sbirri felt ashamed of their irresolution, and indicating by signs that they would fulfill their compact, they entered the room, accompanied by the 2 women. As they had said, a ray of moonlight shone through the open window, and brought into prominence the tranquil face of the old man, the sight of whose white hair so affected them. This time they showed no mercy. One of them carried 2 great nails, such as those portrayed in pictures of the crucifixion. The other bore a mallet. The first placed a nail upright over one of the old man's eyes. The other struck it with a hammer, and drove it into his head. The throat was pierced in the same way with the second nail, and thus the guilty soul, stained throughout its career with crimes of violence, was in its turn violently torn from the body, which lay writhing on the floor where it had rolled. The young girl then, faithful to her word, handed the sbirri a large purse containing the rest of the sum agreed upon, and they left. When they found themselves alone, the women drew the nails out of the wounds, wrapped the corpse in a sheet, and dragged it through the room towards a small rampart, intending to throw it down into a garden which had been allowed to run to waste. They hoped that the old man's death would be attributed to his having accidentally fallen off the terrace on his way in the dark to a closet at the end of the gallery, but their strength failed them when they reached the door of the last room. And while resting there, Lucrezia perceived the two sbirri sharing the money before making their escape. At her call they came to her, carried the corpse to the rampart, and, from a spot pointed out by the women, where the terrace was unfenced by any papare, they threw it into an elder tree below, whose branches retained it suspended. When the body was found the following morning hanging in the branches of the elder tree, everybody supposed, as Beatrice and her stepmother had foreseen, stepping over the edge of the terrace in the dark, had thus met his end. The body was so scratched and disfigured that no one noticed the wounds made by the two nails. The ladies, as soon as the news was imparted to them, came out from their rooms weeping and lamenting in so natural a manner as to disarm any suspicions. The only person who formed any was a laundress to whom Beatrice entrusted the sheet in which her father's body had been wrapped, accounting for its bloody condition by a lame explanation which the laundress accepted without question, or pretended to do so. And immediately after the funeral, the mourners returned to Rome, hoping at length to enjoy quietude and peace. For some time, indeed, they did enjoy tranquillity, perhaps poisoned by remorse, but ere long retribution pursued them. The court of Naples, hearing of the sudden and unexpected death of Francesco Cenci, and conceiving some suspicions of violence, dispatched a royal commissioner to Petrella to exhume the body and to make minute inquiries, if there appeared to be adequate grounds for doing so. On his arrival, all the domestics in the castle were placed under arrest and sent in chains to Naples. No incriminating proofs, however, were found, except in the evidence of the laundress, who deposed that Beatrice had given her a blood-stained sheet to wash. This clue led to terrible consequences. For further questions she declared that she could not believe the explanation given to account for its condition. The evidence was sent to the Roman court, but at that period it did not appear strong enough to warrant the arrest of the Cenci family, who remained undisturbed for many months, during which time the youngest boy died. Of the 5 brothers there only remained Giacomo, the eldest, and Bernardo, the youngest but one. Nothing prevented them from escaping to Venice or Florence, but they remained quietly in Rome. End of section 31. Section 32 of Celebrated Crimes, Volume 1. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Celebrated Crimes, Volume 1 by Alexandre Dumas, translated by G.B. Ives. Section 32. The Cenci, Part 4. Meantime, Monsignor Guerra received private information that, shortly before the death of Francesco, Marzio and Olimpio had been seen prowling round the castle, and that the Neapolitan police had received orders to arrest them. The Monsignor was a most wary man, and very difficult to catch napping when warned in time. He immediately hired 2 other sbirri to assassinate Marzio and Olimpio. The one commissioned to put Olimpio out of the way came across him at Terni, and conscientiously did his work with a poniard, but Marzio's man unfortunately arrived at Naples too late, and found his bird already in the hands of the police. He was put to the torture, and confessed everything. His disposition was sent to Rome, whither he shortly afterwards followed it, to be confronted with the accused. Warrants were immediately issued for the arrest of Giacomo, Bernardo, Lucrezia, and Beatrice. They were at first confined in the Cenci palace under a strong guard, but the proofs against them becoming stronger and stronger, they were removed to the castle of Corte Savella, where they were confronted with Marzio. But they obstinately denied both any complicity in the crime and any knowledge of the assassin. Beatrice, above all, displayed the greatest assurance, demanding to be the first to be confronted with Marzio, whose mendacity she affirmed with such calm dignity that he, more than ever smitten by her beauty, determined, since he could not live for her, to save her by his death. Consequently, he declared all his statements to be false, and asked forgiveness from God and from Beatrice. Neither threats nor tortures could make him recant, and he died firm in his denial, under frightful tortures. The Cenci then thought themselves safe. God's justice, however, still pursued them. The sbirro who had killed Olimpio happened to be arrested for another crime, and, making a clean breast, confessed that he had been employed by Monsignor Guerra to put out of the way a fellow assassin named Olimpio, who knew too many of the Monsignor's secrets. Luckily for himself, Monsignor Guerra heard of this opportunely. A man of infinite resource, he lost not a moment in timid or irresolute plans, but as it happened that at that very moment when he was warned, the charcoal dealer who supplied his house with fuel was at hand. He sent for him, purchased his silence with a handsome bribe, and then, buying for almost their weight in gold the dirty old clothes which he wore, he assumed these, cut off all his beautiful cherished fair hair, stained his beard, smudged his face, bought 2 asses, laden with charcoal, and limped up and down the streets of Rome, crying, "Charcoal! Charcoal!" Then, whilst all the detectives were hunting high and low for him, he got out of the city, met a company of merchants under escort, joined them, and reached Naples, where he embarked. What ultimately became of him was never known. It has been asserted, but without confirmation, that he succeeded in reaching France, and enlisted in a Swiss regiment in the pay of Henry IV. The confession of the sbirro and the disappearance of Monsignor Guerra left no moral doubt of the guilt of the Cenci. They were consequently sent from the castle to the prison. The 2 brothers, when put to the torture, broke down and confessed their guilt. Lucrezia Petroni's full habit of body rendered her unable to bear the torture of the rope, and on being suspended in the air, begged to be lowered when she confessed all she knew. As for Beatrice, she continued unmoved. Neither promises, threats, nor torture had any effect upon her. She bore everything unflinchingly, and the Judge Ulysses Moscati himself, famous though he was in such matters, failed to draw from her a single incriminating word. Unwilling to take any further responsibility, he referred the case to Clement VIII, and the Pope, conjecturing that the judge had been too lenient in applying the torture to a young and beautiful Roman lady, took it out of his hands and entrusted it to another judge, whose severity and insensibility to emotion were undisputed. This latter reopened the whole interrogatory, and as Beatrice up to that time had only been subjected to the ordinary torture, he gave instructions to apply both the ordinary and extraordinary. This was the rope and pulley, one of the most terrible inventions ever devised by the most ingenious of tormentors. To make the nature of this horrid torture plain to our readers, we give a detailed description of it, adding an extract of the presiding judge's report of the case, taken from the Vatican manuscripts. Of the various forms of torture then used in Rome, the most common were the whistle, the fire, the sleepless, and the rope. The mildest, the torture of the whistle, was used only in the case of children and old persons. It consisted in thrusting between the nails and the flesh reeds cut in the shape of whistles. The fire, frequently employed before the invention of the sleepless torture, was simply roasting the soles of the feet before a hot fire. The sleepless torture, invented by Marsilius, was worked by forcing the accused into an angular frame of wood about 5 feet high, the sufferer being stripped and his arms tied behind his back to the frame. 2 men, relieved every 5 hours, sat beside him, and roused him the moment he closed his eyes. Marsilius says he has never found a man proof against this torture, but here he claims more than he is justly entitled to. Farinacci states that, out of 100 accused persons subjected to it, 5 only refused to confess. A very satisfactory result for the inventor. Lastly comes the torture of the rope and pulley, the most in vogue of all, and known in other Latin countries as the strappado. It was divided into 3 degrees of intensity, the slight, the severe, and the very severe. The first, or slight torture, which consisted mainly in the apprehensions it caused, comprised the threat of severe torture, introduction into the torture chamber, stripping, and the tying of the rope in readiness for its appliance. To increase the terror these preliminaries excited, a pang of physical pain was added by tightening a cord round the wrists. This often sufficed to extract a confession from women or men of highly strung nerves. The second, or severe torture, consisted in fastening the sufferer stripped naked and his hands tied behind his back by the wrists to one end of a rope passed round a pulley bolted into the vaulted ceiling, the other end being attached to a windlass, by turning which he could be hoisted into the air, and dropped again, either slowly or with a jerk, as ordered by the judge. The suspension generally lasted during the recital of a paternoster, an Ave Maria, or a Miserere. If the accused persisted in his denial, it was doubled. This second degree, the last of the ordinary torture, was put in practice when the crime appeared reasonably probable, but was not absolutely proved. The third, or very severe, the first of the extraordinary forms of torture, was so called when the sufferer, having hung suspended by the wrists for sometimes a whole hour, was swung about by the executioner either like the pendulum of a clock, or by elevating him with a windlass and dropping him to within a foot or two of the ground. If he stood this torture, a thing almost unheard of, seeing that it cut the flesh of the wrist to the bone and dislocated the limbs, weights were attached to the feet, thus doubling the torture. This last form of torture was only applied when an atrocious crime had been proved to have been committed upon a sacred person, such as a priest, a cardinal, a prince, or an eminent and learned man. Having seen that Beatrice was sentenced to the torture ordinary and extraordinary, and having explained the nature of these tortures, we proceed to quote the official report. And as in reply to every question she would confess nothing, we caused her to be taken by 2 officers and led from the prison to the torture chamber, where the torturer was in attendance. There, after cutting off her hair, he made her sit on a small stool, undressed her, pulled off her shoes, tied her hands behind her back, fastened them to a rope passed over a pulley bolted into the ceiling of the aforesaid chamber, and wound up at the other end by a 4-lever windlass worked by 2 men. Before hoisting her from the ground, we again interrogated her touching the aforesaid parricide, but notwithstanding the confessions of her brother and her stepmother, which were again produced bearing their signatures, she persisted in denying everything, saying, "Haul me about and do what you like with me. I have spoken the truth, and will tell you nothing else, even if I were torn to pieces." Upon this we had her hoisted in the air by the wrists to the height of about 2 feet from the ground, while we recited a paternoster, and then again questioned her as to the facts and circumstances of the aforesaid parricide. But she would make no further answer, only saying, "You are killing me! You are killing me!" We then raised her to the elevation of 4 feet, and began an Ave Maria, but before our prayer was half finished she fainted away, or pretended to do so. We caused a bucketful of water to be thrown over her head. Feeling its coolness, she recovered consciousness and cried, "My God, I am dead! You are killing me! My God!" But this was all she would say. We then raised her higher still, and recited a Miserere, during which, instead of joining in the prayer, she shook convulsively and cried several times, "My God, my God!" Again questioned as to the aforesaid parricide, she would confess nothing, saying only that she was innocent, and then again fainted away. We caused more water to be thrown over her. Then she recovered her senses, opened her eyes, and cried, "O cursed executioners! You are killing me! You are killing me!" But nothing more would she say. Seeing which, and that she persisted in her denial, we ordered the torturer to proceed to the torture by jerks. He accordingly hoisted her 10 feet from the ground, and when there, we enjoined her to tell the truth. But whether she would not or could not speak, she answered only by a motion of the head, indicating that she could say nothing. Seeing which, we made a sign to the executioner to let go the rope, and she fell with all her weight from the height of 10 feet to that of 2 feet. Her arms from the shock were dislocated from the sockets. She uttered a loud cry, and swooned away. We again caused water to be dashed in her face. She returned to herself and again cried out, "Infamous assassins, you are killing me, but were you to tear out my arms, I would tell you nothing else." Upon this, we ordered a weight of 50 pounds to be fastened to her feet. But at this moment the door opened, and many voices cried, "Enough, enough, do not torture her any more." These voices were those of Giacomo, Bernardo, and Lucrezia Petroni. The judges, perceiving the obstinacy of Beatrice, had ordered that the accused, who had been separated for 5 months, should be confronted. They advanced into the torture chamber, and seeing Beatrice hanging by the wrists, her arms disjointed and covered with blood, Giacomo cried out, "The sin is committed. Nothing further remains but to save our souls by repentance. Undergo death courageously, and not suffer you to be thus tortured." Then said Beatrice, shaking her head as if to cast off grief, "Do you then wish to die? Since you wish it, be it so." Then turning to the officers, "Untie me," said she. "Read the examination to me, and what I have to confess I will confess. What I have to deny I will deny." Beatrice was then lowered and untied. A barber reduced the dislocation of her arms in the usual manner. The examination was read over to her, and as she had promised, she made a full confession. After this confession, at the request of the 2 brothers, they were all confined in the same prison. But the next day Giacomo and Bernardo were taken to the cells of Tordinona. As for the women, they remained where they were. End of section 32.
As the sun sinks low, painting the fields in gold, I take a breath of freedom, letting go
Section 33 of Celebrated Crimes, Volume 1. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Celebrated Crimes, Volume 1 by Alexandre Dumas. Translated by G.B. Ives. Section 33. The Cenci, Part 5. The Pope was so horrified on reading the particulars of the crime contained in the confessions that he ordered the culprits to be dragged by wild horses through the streets of Rome. But so barbarous a sentence shocked the public mind, so much so that many persons of princely rank petitioned the Holy Father on their knees, imploring him to reconsider his decree, or at least allow the accused to be heard in their defense. "Tell me," replied Clement VIII, "did they give their unhappy father time to be heard in his own defense, when they slew him in so merciless and degrading a fashion?" At length, overcome by so many entreaties, he respited them for 3 days. The most eloquent and skilful advocates in Rome immediately busied themselves in preparing pleadings for so emotional a case, and on the day fixed for hearing appeared before His Holiness. The first pleader was Niccolo degli Angeli, who spoke with such force and eloquence that the Pope, alarmed at the effect he was producing among the audience, passionately interrupt him. "Are there then to be found," he indignantly cried, "among the Roman nobility children capable of killing their parents, and among Roman lawyers men capable of speaking in their defense? This is a thing we should never have believed, nor even for a moment supposed it possible." All were silent upon this terrible rebuke, except Farinacci, who, nerving himself with a strong sense of duty, replied respectfully but firmly, "Most Holy Father, we are not here to defend criminals, but to save the innocent. For if we succeeded in proving that any of the accused acted in self-defense, I hope that they will be exonerated in the eyes of your Holiness. For just as the law provides for cases in which the father may legally kill the child, so this holds good in the converse. We will therefore continue our pleadings on receiving leave from your Holiness to do so." Clement VIII then showed himself as patient as he had previously been hasty, and heard the argument of Farinacci, who pleaded that Francesco Cenci had lost all the rights of a father from the day that he violated his daughter. In support of his contention he wished to put in the memorial sent by Beatrice to His Holiness, petitioning him as her sister had done. to remove her from the paternal roof and place her in a convent. Unfortunately, this petition had disappeared, and notwithstanding the minutest search among the papal documents, no trace of it could be found. The Pope had all the pleadings collected, and dismissed the advocates, who then retired, except Daltieri, who knelt before him, saying, "Most Holy Father, I humbly ask pardon for appearing before you in this case, but I had no choice in the matter, being the advocate of the poor." The Pope kindly raised him, saying, "Go, we are not surprised at your conduct, but at that of others, who protect and defend criminals." As the Pope took a great interest in this case, he sat up all night over it, studying it with Cardinal di San Marcello, a man of much acumen and great experience in criminal cases. Then, having summed it up, he sent a draft of his opinion to the advocates, who read it with great satisfaction, and entertained hopes that the lives of the convicted persons would be spared. For the evidence all went to prove that even if the children had taken their father's life, all the provocation came from him, and that Beatrice in particular had been dragged into the part she had taken in this crime by the tyranny, wickedness, and brutality of her father. Under the influence of these considerations, the Pope mitigated the severity of their prison life, and even allowed the prisoners to hope that their lives would not be forfeited. Amidst the general feeling of relief afforded to the public by these favors, another tragical event changed the papal mind and frustrated all his humane intentions. This was the atrocious murder of the Marchese di Santa Croce, a man 70 years of age, by his son Paolo, who stabbed him with a dagger in 15 or 20 places, because the father would not promise to make Paolo his sole heir. The murderer fled and escaped. Clement VIII was horror-stricken at the increasing frequency of this crime of parricide. For the moment, however, he was unable to take action, having to go to Montecavallo to consecrate a titular bishop in the church of Santa Maria degli Angeli. But the day following, on Friday the 10th of September, 1599, at 8 o'clock in the morning, he summoned Monsignor Taverna, governor of Rome, and said to him, "Monsignor, we place in your hands the Cenci case, that you may carry out the sentence as speedily as possible." On his return to his palace, after leaving his holiness, the governor convened a meeting of all the criminal judges in the city, the result of the council being that all the Cenci were condemned to death. The final sentence was immediately known, and as this unhappy family inspired a constantly increasing interest, many cardinals spent the whole of the night either on horseback or in their carriages, making interest that, at least so far as the women were concerned, they should be put to death privately and in the prison, and that a free pardon should be granted to Bernardo, a poor lad only 15 years of age, who, guiltless of any participation in the crime, yet found himself involved in its consequences. The one who interested himself most in the case was Cardinal Sforza, who nevertheless failed to elicit a single gleam of hope, so obdurate was his holiness. At length Farinacci, working on the conscience, succeeded, after long and urgent entreaties, and only at the last moment, that the life of Bernardo should be spared. From Friday evening the members of the Brotherhood of the Conforteria had gathered at the two prisons of Cortesavella and Tordinona. The preparations for the closing scene of the tragedy had occupied workmen on the bridge of Sant'Angelo all night, and it was not till 5 o'clock in the morning that the registrar entered the cell of Lucrezia and Beatrice to read their sentences to them. Both were sleeping, calm in the belief of a reprieve. The registrar woke them and told them that, judged by man, they must now prepare to appear before God. Beatrice was at first thunderstruck. She seemed paralyzed and speechless. Then she rose from bed, and staggering as if intoxicated, recovered her speech, uttering despairing cries. Lucrezia heard the tidings with more firmness, and proceeded to dress herself to go to the chapel, exhorting Beatrice to resignation, but she, raving, wrung her hands and struck her head against the wall, shrieking, To die! To die! Am I to die unprepared, on a scaffold, on a gibbet? My God! My God!" This fit led to a terrible paroxysm, after which the exhaustion of her body enabled her mind to recover its balance, and from that moment she became an angel of humility, an example of resignation. Her first request was for a notary to make her will. This was immediately complied with, and on his arrival she dictated its provisions with much calmness and precision. Its last clause desired her interment in the church of San Pietro in Montorio, for which she always had a strong attachment, as it commanded a view of her father's palace. She bequeathed 500 crowns to the nuns of the order of the Stigmata, and ordered that her dowry, amounting to 15,000 crowns, should be distributed in marriage portions to 50 poor girls. She selected the foot of the high altar as the place where she wished to be buried, over which hung the beautiful picture of the Transfiguration, so often admired by her during her life. Following her example, Lucrezia in turn disposed of her property. She desired to be buried in the church of San Giorgio di Vellobre, and left 32,000 crowns to charities, with other pious legacies. Having settled their earthly affairs, they joined in prayer, reciting psalms, litanies, and prayers for the dying. At 8 o'clock they confessed, heard Mass, and received the sacraments, after which Beatrice, observing to her stepmother that the rich dresses they wore were out of place on the scaffold, ordered 2 to be made in nun's fashion, that is to say, gathered at the neck, with long wide sleeves. That for Lucrezia was made for black cotton stuff, Beatrice's of taffetas. In addition, she had a small black turban made to place on her head. These dresses, with cords for girdles, were brought them. They were placed on a chair, while the women continued to pray. The time appointed being near at hand, they were informed that their last moment was approaching. Then Beatrice, who was still on her knees, rose with a tranquil and almost joyful countenance. "Mother," she said, "the moment of our suffering is impending. I think we had better dress in these clothes, and help one another at our toilet for the last time." They then put on the dresses provided, girt themselves with the cords. Beatrice placed her turban on her head, and they awaited the last summons. In the meantime Giacomo and Bernardo, whose sentences had been read to them, awaited also the moment of their death. About 10 o'clock the members of the Confraternity of Mercy, a Florentine order, arrived at the prison of Tordinona, and halted on the threshold with the crucifix, awaiting the appearance of the unhappy youths. Here a serious accident nearly happened. As many persons were at the prison windows to see the prisoners come out, someone accidentally threw down a large flower-pot full of earth, which fell into the street and narrowly missed one of the confraternity, who was amongst the torch-bearers just before the crucifix. It passed so close to the torch as to extinguish the flame in its descent. At this moment the gates opened, and Giacomo appeared first on the threshold. He fell on his knees, adoring the holy crucifix with great devotion. He was completely covered with a large mourning cloak, under which his bare breast was exposed to be torn by the red-hot pincers of the executioner, which were lying ready in a chafing dish fixed to the cart. Having ascended the vehicle, in which the executioner placed him, so as more readily to perform this office, Bernardo came out, and was thus addressed on his appearance by the fiscal of Rome. "Signor Bernardo Cenci, in the name of our blessed Redeemer, our Holy Father the Pope spares your life, with the sole condition that you accompany your relatives to the scaffold and to their death, and never forget to pray for those with whom you were condemned to die." At this unexpected intelligence, a loud murmur of joy spread among the crowd, and the members of the confraternity immediately untied the small mask which covered the youth's eyes, for, owing to his tender age, it had been thought proper to conceal the scaffold from his sight. Then the executioner, having disposed of Giacomo, came down from the cart to take Bernardo, whose pardon being formally communicated to him, he took off his handcuffs and placed him alongside his brother, covering him up with a magnificent cloak embroidered with gold, for the neck and shoulders of the poor lad had already been bared as a preliminary to his decapitation. People were surprised to see such a cloak in the possession of the executioner, but were told that it was the one given by Beatrice de Marzio to pledge him to the murder of her father, which fell to the executioner as a prerequisite after the execution of the assassin. The sight of the great assemblage of people produced such an effect upon the boy that he fainted. End of section 33. Section 34 of Celebrated Crimes, Volume 1. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Celebrated Crimes, Volume 1 by Alexandre Dumas. Translated by G.B. Ives. Section 34, The Cenci, Part 6. The procession then proceeded to the prison of Corte Savella, marching to the sound of funeral chants. At its gates the sacred crucifix halted for the women to join. They soon appeared, fell on their knees, and worshipped the holy symbol as the others had done. The march to the scaffold was then resumed. The two female prisoners followed the last row of penitents in single file, veiled to the waist, with the distinction that Lucrezia, as a widow, wore a black veil and high-heeled slippers of the same hue, with bows of ribbon, as was the fashion, whilst Beatrice, as a young unmarried girl, wore a silk flat cap to match her corsage, with a plush hood, which fell over her shoulders and covered her violet frock, white slippers with white high heels, ornated with gold rosettes and cherry-colored fringe. The arms of both were untrammeled, except for a thin slack cord which left their hands free to carry a crucifix and a handkerchief. During the night a lofty scaffold had been erected on the bridge of Sant'Angelo, and the plank and block were placed thereon. Above the block was hung, from a large cross-beam, a ponderous axe, which, guided by two grooves, fell with its whole weight at the touch of a spring. In this formation the procession wended its way towards the bridge of Sant'Angelo. Lucrezia, the more broken down of the two, wept bitterly, but Beatrice was firm and unmoved. On arriving at the open space before the bridge, the women were led into a chapel, where they were shortly joined by Giacomo and Bernardo. They remained together for a few moments, when the brothers were led away to the scaffold, although one was to be executed last, and the other was pardoned. But when they had mounted the platform, Bernardo fainted a second time, and as the executioner was approaching to his assistance, some of the crowd, supposing that his object was to decapitate him, cried loudly, "He is pardoned!" The executioner reassured them by seating Bernardo near the block, Giacomo kneeling on the other side. Then the executioner descended, entered the chapel, and reappeared leading Lucrezia, who was the first to suffer. At the foot of the scaffold he tied her hands behind her back, tore open the top of her corsage, so as to uncover her shoulders, gave her the crucifix to kiss, and led her to the step-ladder, which she ascended with great difficulty, on account of her extreme stoutness. Then, on her reaching the platform, he removed the veil which covered her head. On this exposure of her features to the immense crowd, Lucrezia shuddered from head to foot. Then, her eyes full of tears, she cried with a loud voice, "O my God, have mercy upon me, and do you, brethren, pray for my soul." Having uttered these words, not knowing what was required of her, she turned to Alessandro, the chief executioner, and asked what she was to do. He told her to bestride the plank and lie prone upon it, which she did with great trouble and timidity. But as she was unable, on account of the fullness of her bust, to lay her neck upon the block, this had to be raised by placing a billet of wood underneath it. All this time, the poor woman, suffering even more from shame than from fear, was kept in suspense. At length, when she was properly adjusted, the executioner touched the spring, the knife fell, and the decapitated head, falling on the platform of the scaffold, bounded 2 or 3 times in the air, to the general horror. The executioner then seized it, showed it to the multitude, and wrapping it in black taffetas, placed it with the body on a bier at the foot of the scaffold. Whilst arrangements were made for the decapitation of Beatrice, several stands full of spectators broke down. Some people were killed by this accident, and still more lamed and injured. The machine being now rearranged and washed, the executioner returned to the chapel to take charge of Beatrice, who, on seeing the sacred crucifix, said some prayers for her soul, and on her hands being tied, cried out, "God grant that you be binding this body unto corruption, and loosing this soul unto life eternal." She then arose, proceeded to the platform, where she devoutly kissed the stigmata. Then, leaving her slippers at the foot of the scaffold, she nimbly ascended the ladder, and, instructed beforehand, promptly lay down on the plank, without exposing her naked shoulders. But her precautions to shorten the bitterness of death were of no avail, for the Pope, knowing her impetuous disposition, and fearing lest she might be led into the commission of some sin between absolution and death, had given orders that the moment Beatrice was extended on the scaffold, a signal gun should be fired from the castle of Sant'Angelo, which was done, to the great astonishment of everybody, including Beatrice herself, who, not expecting this explosion, raised herself almost upright. The Pope, meanwhile, who was praying at Monte Cavallo, gave her absolution in articulo mortis. About 5 minutes thus passed, during which the sufferer waited with her head replaced on the block. At length, when the executioner judged that the absolution had been given, he released the spring, and the axe fell. A gruesome sight was then afforded. Whilst the head bounced away on one side of the block, on the other the body rose erect, as if about to step backwards. The executioner exhibited the head, and disposed of it, and the body as before. He wished to place Beatrice's body with that of her stepmother, but the Brotherhood of Mercy took it out of her hands, and as one of them was attempting to lay it on the bier, it slipped from him and fell from the scaffold to the ground below, the dress being partially torn from the body, which was so besmeared with dust and blood that much time was occupied in washing it. Poor Bernardo was so overcome by this horrible scene that he swooned away for the 3rd time, and it was necessary to revive him with stimulants to witness the fate of his elder brother. The turn of Giacomo at length arrived. He had witnessed the death of his stepmother and his sister, and his clothes were covered with their blood. The executioner approached him and tore off his cloak, exposing his bare breast covered with the wounds caused by the grip of red-hot pincers. In this state, and half naked, he rose to his feet, and turning to his brother said, "Bernardo, if in my examination I have compromised and accused you, I have done so falsely, and although I have already disavowed this declaration, I repeat, at the moment of appearing before God, that you are innocent, and that it is a cruel abuse of justice to compel you to witness this frightful spectacle." The executioner then made him kneel down, bound his legs to one of the beams erected on the scaffold, and having bandaged his eyes, shattered his head with a blow of his mallet. Then, in the sight of all, he hacked his body into 4 quarters. The official party then left, taking with them Bernardo, who, being in a state of high fever, was bled and put to bed. The corpses of the 2 ladies were laid out, each on its own bier, under the statue of St. Paul, at the foot of the bridge, with 4 torches of white wax, which burned until 4 o'clock in the afternoon. Then, along with the remains of Giacomo, they were taken to the church of San Giovanni Decollato. Finally, about 9 in the evening, the body of Beatrice, covered with flowers, and attired in the dress worn at her execution, was carried to the church of San Pietro in Montorio, with 50 lighted torches, and followed by the brethren of the Order of the Stigmata, and all the Franciscan monks in Rome. There, agreeably to her wish, it was buried at the foot of the high altar. The same evening Signora Lucrezia was interred, as she had desired to be, in the church of San Giorgio di Vellobre. All Rome may be said to have been present at this tragedy. Carriages, horses, foot-people, and cars crowding, as it were, upon one another. The day was unfortunately so hot, and the sun so scorching, that many persons fainted. Others returned home stricken with fever, and some even died during the night, owing to sunstroke from exposure during the 3 hours occupied by the execution. The Tuesday following, the 14th of September, being the feast of the Holy Cross, the Brotherhood of San Marcello, by special license of the Pope, set at liberty the unhappy Bernardo Cenci, with the condition of paying within the year 2,500 Roman crowns to the Brotherhood of the Most Holy Trinity of Pope Sixtus, as may be found today recorded in their archives. Having now seen the tomb, if you desire to form a more vivid impression of the principal actors in this tragedy than can be derived from a narrative, pay a visit to the Barberini Gallery, where you will see, with 5 other masterpieces by Guido, the portrait of Beatrice, taken, some say the night before her execution, others during her progress to the scaffold. It is the head of a lovely girl, wearing a headdress composed of a turban with a lappet. The hair is of a rich, fair chestnut hue. The dark eyes are moistened with recent tears. A perfectly formed nose surmounts an infantile mouth. Unfortunately, the loss of tone in the picture, since it was painted, has destroyed the original fair complexion. The age of the subject may be 20 or perhaps 22 years. Near this portrait is that of Lucrezia Petrani. The small head indicates a person below the middle height. The attributes are those of a Roman matron in her pride, her high complexion, graceful contour, straight nose, black eyebrows, and expression at the same time imperious and voluptuous indicate this character to the life. A smile still seems to linger on the charming, dimpled cheeks and perfect mouth mentioned by the chronicler, and her face is exquisitely framed by luxuriant curls falling from her forehead in graceful profusion. As for Giacomo and Bernardo, as no portraits of them are in existence, we are obliged to gather an idea of their appearance from the manuscript which has enabled us to compile this sanguinary history. They are thus described by the eyewitness of the closing scene. Giacomo was short, well-made, and strong, with black hair and beard. He appeared to be about 26 years of age. Poor Bernardo was the image of his sister, so nearly resembling her that when he mounted the scaffold his long hair and girlish face led people to suppose him to be Beatrice herself. He might be 14 or 15 years of age. The peace of God be with them. End of section 34. Recording by Stephen Carney, Neenah, Wisconsin. End of Celebrated Crimes, Volume 1, by Alexandre Dumas, Père. Translated by G.B. Ives.